Good morning, folks. Folks could just take a moment to reach your seats. We'll go ahead and start up in just a moment. It's great to see such a large group here, and also I believe we've got a couple thousand people online. Good morning. Welcome to our convening titled Optimizing the Use of Real-World Evidence in Regulatory Decision-Making for Drugs and Biologics Products. Looking forward. I'm Garrett Homry, Research Director at Duke Margolis, Institute for Health Policy at Duke University. Duke Margolis is convening this workshop under a cooperative agreement with U.S. Food and Drug Administration. The conversation today, while supported through a cooperative agreement with the FDA, is not a federal advisory committee. We will not be voting, making recommendations, or binding changes. Instead, what the workshop aims to do is provide an update as well as solicit input from all interested parties here online, and you'll see lots of follow-up opportunities as well, on current and future activities related to the FDA Real-World Evidence Program for Drugs and Biological Products. We'll be hearing from a variety of experts today, from academia, industry, and FDA about FDA's approach to evaluating RWE for regulatory decision-making, ongoing opportunities and challenges related to RWE, and future initiatives for promoting the appropriate use. On the next slide, we'll review, I think I've got access here. There we are. On the next slide, I'll review the panel discussions and presentations teed up on the agenda. We'll, maybe slightly out of order, one moment. We'll begin today with brief pre-recorded remarks from FDA Commissioner Robert Califf. Next, John Concato, Associate Director for Real-World Evidence Analytics in the Office of Medical Policy and the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, will provide an overview of the FDA's RWE program. Afterwards, we'll hear about future directions in the RWE space from Jacqueline Corrigan-Caray, the Principal Deputy Center Director in FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Then Jacqueline and John will join me in a fireside chat where they'll reflect on accomplishments and discuss current and future RWE-related activities, such as guidance documents, research projects, FDA 7 commitments, and additional associated activities. After a short break, we'll resume with a session entitled Opportunities and Challenges when Using Real-World Data, moderated by my colleague Rachel Hendricks-Sturrup. During this session, panelists will discuss the role of artificial intelligence in this space, collaborative approaches to RWE data, both sourcing and curation, as well as whether there's an emerging consensus among regulators for key concepts such as data reliability and relevance. After another break, we'll reconvene for session 2, moderated by colleague Trevin Locke, entitled Methodological Considerations for RWE. Panelists will discuss pressing methodological considerations, as well as challenges and potential solutions for generating RWE for regulatory decision-making. The discussion will also highlight opportunities to incorporate RWD into randomized clinical trials, in addition to non-randomized methodological approaches. Now let me turn to our statement of independence and the final logistical reminders before we get the meeting started with opening remarks from our FDA Commissioner. The Duke Margolis Institute for Health Policy at Duke Margolis, we're an independent academic institution, and as such, we honor the tradition of that independence on behalf of its faculty and its scholars. We just have really one more slide with some meeting reminders before we get to our opening remarks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rob Califf, Commissioner of FDA, and I'm really excited and disappointed at the same time here. When I heard about this meeting on real-world data and real-world evidence, I was really excited about the chance to participate because it's been such a vital part of my career and something which I think is so important for the future of the FDA and for the future of therapeutics and diagnostics. Looking at the agenda, having a discussion format, initially talking about real-world data, the basic infrastructure needed to produce data of adequate quality for both regulatory purposes and to inform decisions about clinical practice. Now is a great time to have that discussion. But then to go on and talk about real-world evidence, how to make inferences from the data what sorts of study designs are best, how to ensure that the right questions are being answered. Another great topic for discussion. We just had a session on cardiovascular trials at the CBCT meeting, so-called, and it was amazing to hear the progress that's being made across the spectrum of sources of real-world data and real-world evidence from all parts of the world. It's almost as if things that were dreamed about 30 years ago are now gradually coming true and may hit a tipping point soon where things will really take off. I'm also very excited about the use of artificial intelligence to make the data better and to help us with study design. Unfortunately for me, today I'm tromping, during this meeting, I'm tromping around in the pastures of California because of the avian influenza outbreak in cows. An important part of my job and something I'm learning a lot about. And I look forward to hearing about this meeting that you all are having and everything that can be learned from it. So I wish you well, glad you're having the meeting, and look forward to seeing the results of the meeting.
Before I turn to John Concato, attendees, whether in person or virtual, are encouraged to contribute to the meeting. We've got a couple opportunities to do so. First, through the Slido Q&A function, which will be passed along, where we'll pass along questions that we receive either from folks in the room or via the virtual audience, so we can ensure we have that incorporated opportunity for you all. Also, we'll have running mics once we get to the later sessions where we've got presentations and open dialogue. So please keep an eye out for that. Next, I will turn to you, old friend John Concato, Associate Director for Real World Evidence Analytics in the Office of Medical Policy in Cedar. He'll be presenting on FDA's RWE program, and afterwards we'll turn to Jacqueline Corrigan-Karai for another brief presentation. John.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you to our hosts. Thanks to attendees both in the room as well as virtual. The usual disclaimers, this presentation reflects my views and is not official FDA policy. I do not have any conflict of interest to report. And when I do mention a commercial product, it's not an actual nor an implied endorsement. If you want to keep track of where I am in my 15 minutes or so, 25 minutes actually, I'm going to start with a historical overview. We're here to talk about the future, but it's worth looking back in the past, almost from a sociological perspective. Then I'll run through for the bulk of my time the evolution of FDA's real-world evidence program for drugs and biologic products, guidance documents, demonstration projects, external engagement, internal agency processes, including the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, and selected examples. And then we'll turn to looking forward. I will say, as you've heard already several times, this is for drugs and biological products. We're here under the CDER umbrella. We work very closely with the Center for Biologics and with the Oncology Center of Excellence, who's well represented on the panels. So we'll keep track of the administrative distinctions versus the clinical and regulatory-based distinctions. All right, so let's take a quick look back. I decided to start around 1990, and all of us virtually have seen this pyramid or triangle in terms of the strength of evidence. My point here is that as much good as quote-unquote evidence-based medicine did, in hindsight, the hierarchies of study design are overly simplistic. We abandoned the gold standard, I'll point out, in economics, but that's a discussion for another day. We might be better off talking about the archetype study design than necessarily something is automatically gold, but more about that to come. But the main point here is that non-randomized studies were taught to a generation of clinicians, epidemiologists, almost to be not trustworthy. So a few selected examples to make this point more specific. This is one of the prominent publications in JAMA from 1992, I believe. It is now accepted that virtually no drug can enter clinical practice without demonstration of its efficacy in clinical trials, emphasis added. But I wanted, and that article was cited more than 6,000 times by one search that I did, one search engine. In terms of double digits or maybe 100 times at most, developing improved observational methods for evaluating therapeutic effectiveness. An observational cohort method based on the design principles and patient assembly procedures of an RCT closely approximate the results of an experimental trial. If that sounds vaguely familiar, please stay tuned. This is not the current version of what we talk about all the time, but it's an archival example done by a different group. Let's fast forward to the 2000s. An editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine said, quote, "Only randomized treatment assignment can provide a reliably unbiased estimate of treatment effects." One might say, well, what was this editorial written in response to? It was a paper in the same issue that said the results of well-designed observational studies with either a cohort or case control design did not systematically overestimate the magnitude of the effects of treatment compared with those in RCTs on the same topic, sort of pushing against the current dogma or the then current dogma at the time. But again, not making much traction. Here's the sociologic part. Now, if we fast forward to our decade, the 2020s, I think everyone in this room has seen The Magic of Randomization versus the Myth of Real-World Evidence, which said because of the potential biases inherent in observational studies, such studies cannot generally be trusted. So maybe a little bit of wiggle room, but still almost suggesting it's a binary space. But here's where I'm connecting dots to the 1990 publication. Target trial emulation is something that's a buzzword these days. The goal of target trial emulation is to avoid making fundamental errors that can result in erroneous causal conclusions. So this is part of a change, a pendulum shift in terms of almost ignoring observational studies, which, by the way, we used for decades for safety and just didn't call it real-world evidence. I know most in the audience know this, but it's worth understanding what's happening at the historical level. And I'll just give one example because this in my career has been probably brought up more times than any other specific example about hormone replacement therapy, sort of quote unquote, proving that observational studies are not trustworthy. For randomized trials, the start of therapy is a natural analysis because therapy starts at randomization. The first years of hormone replacement therapy did increase coronary disease, which then waned. But most current users in observational studies done at the time without all of the methodologic insights we currently have were past the window wherein coronary heart disease was increased. So when the investigators went back and data from the observational part of the trial were reanalyzed according to time since start of therapy, the same pattern emerged. So I submit to you all, the Drug Outcome Association exists in the world. It's up to us to use the right methods to get an answer in terms of what that association is or isn't. So again, this could be a talk unto itself, but if this has been helpful, I'll summarize by saying, why are we here? Why did the 21st Century Cures Act get passed in 2016 for that matter? Really, the first bullet point is probably most relevant. It's the improved access to and rapid analysis of information in the era of big data that's changed everything. I'm old enough to remember doing paper-based medical record reviews. I'm sure there are others who have done the same. It's just not feasible, not scalable for what we need to do. I showed a couple of examples of research showing that observational studies can generate results similar to those of RCTs. It ain't easy, but it's possible, and too many things, more things can go wrong, but nonetheless, we should be aware of that. We're not pinning it all in the 21st Century Cures Act. Obviously, the enthusiasm for that act had to come from somewhere, but I will say that, in my humble opinion, real-world data and real-world evidence as buzzwords were fueled by the 21st Century Cures Act. And then just the popularity of real world as a term, it's a buzzword, it resonates. Although if you Medline or otherwise search, you could find real world data, real world evidence as early as the 1970s or 1960s, but in very isolated, almost ad hoc, bespoke contexts. And I've said this before, if you've heard another FDA talk, confusion reigns with regard to real world data, real world evidence. I use it as shorthand as well, but please appreciate most of the underlying methodology is not new. You could describe the data source, you could describe the study design, what we learned in epidemiology or wherever we were taught, and that would be just fine. But we're here today to talk about RWD, RWE. Okay, thanks to the audiovisual team. I was worried that the 10 minutes was less than I was given and was evaporating, but that was for the speaker before me. So I'm good. All right, so now let's get into the heart of the matter. The 21st Century Cures Act, as just mentioned, let the record show we met our mandates. We established a program on schedule to evaluate the potential use. We're here today to sort of hasten that use for a new indication for a drug already approved or to satisfy post-approval study requirements. The framework was issued in 2018, guidance in 2021 through this year, but please appreciate the standard for substantial evidence is unchanged. I doubt this audience needs to know the definitions as per the framework, but we talk about routinely collected data from a variety of sources, EHRs, medical claims, registries, others. And importantly, on the right, the reason to show this slide is please understand that randomized trials, in addition to externally controlled trials and observational studies, can generate real-world evidence when they use meaningful real-world data, such as point-of-care trials that collect the outcome passively through EHRs. The dichotomy of randomized trials versus real-world evidence is a false dichotomy. Many may have seen this slide because we show it often. It still seems relevant. I don't want to take too much time on it, but basically this is the landscape of study designs with increasing reliance on real-world data, as shown at the bottom, going from left to right. What we now call real-world data is always used in traditional trials for planning purposes. The streptomycin trial in the 1940s had to find the patients from somewhere, had to pick the sites from somewhere. They use what we now call real-world data. It seems pointless to rebrand that as a real-world evidence study. However, the point of care trials that I mentioned, I'll give a shout out to the Veterans Affairs Department that did a diuretic comparison project, not for regulatory decision-making purposes, but they randomized a hydrochlorothiazide versus chlorthalidone, collected the cardiovascular and mortality outcomes passively. A great example of how real-world data in trials can be generated. Externally controlled trials, I think this audience appreciates if the real-world data arm comes, if the comparator arm comes from a real-world data source, that's real-world evidence. And then, of course, observational cohort studies on the right. Here's where we as a team have been very busy. Our office, our colleagues, our sister centers, a lot of people work very hard at FDA on this. This is a listing of our guidance on drugs and biologic products. You see the logic, hopefully, by focusing on the middle category. Data considerations and data submission is where I'll start. EHR claims and registries covered. Data standards. We don't fault our predecessors for creating data standards for clinical trials, which were the rule of the day. Now we have an ability to, at least until or unless regulations change, accept data from real-world data sources. Please see guidance. Regulatory considerations with our colleagues in the Office of Regulatory Policy and overarching guidance on what do you do when IND regulations don't apply. Again, not foreseen in the past century, but that's okay. We were able to get things done with providing recommendations based on existing regulations. And then last but not least, the design considerations category, externally controlled trials, non-interventional studies, and last but not least, randomized trials in clinical practice settings, which stands on its own merits as a clinical trial guidance, but we can have it both ways because when the point of care trial is involved, it is generating real world evidence. And then a procedural guidance on submitting real world evidence. If that table wasn't logical enough, this figure has the exact same information, but shown in a diagram, obviously. The implementation framework can be linked to our 2018 framework document. Then we have data on the left, regulatory considerations in the middle, mid-row, in the middle vertically, in the middle horizontally, and then design guidance is on the right. So this is not all inclusive. One could say, what about hybrid trials, wherein a traditional trial adds real-world data patients to the comparator arm? Our guidance covers that, but we do not have extensive details. And just to close the loop on this portion of the talk, back to that ecosystem, the guidances on real-world data are not shown, but as mentioned earlier, the three boxes on the right are relevant to real-world evidence, whereas the box on the left, there's plenty of FDA guidance on clinical trials, but it's not part of the real-world evidence program's remit. Okay, shifting gears a bit. Now let's talk about demonstration projects. The R in CEDAR and CBER stands for research. We don't have a huge budget, but we do try to, quote unquote, seed the field, while others in the field also generate research that helps move things forward. So we have various funding mechanisms. If you're not familiar, UO1 cooperative agreements, broad agency announcements. Here are funded centers of excellence in regulatory science and innovation, as well as interagency agreements, one of them with the Department of Veterans Affairs, not for their trial that I mentioned earlier, but for other work, and Sentinel and FDA Catalyst initiatives. I don't have time to present a lot of detail, so I instead will do two things. One is give a broad overview, one of three general categories. This is a very informal taxonomy, so please don't shoot holes in it, poke holes in it. One would be improving the quality or the use of real-world data. One of the projects is evaluation of unstructured EHR data, the so-called TRUST project that you might hear about more later. And as well, a one-source project to improve the quality of EHR data. The theme there is why wouldn't clinicians want the same quality of research, the same quality of data at the bedside that researchers expect later. The second category informally is study design. Here's where the acronym RCT duplicate trial emulations, you may have heard about that project, as well as statistical approaches for trial designs with hybrid control arms, as I mentioned earlier. So even though we don't have a separate guidance, we're improving the fund of knowledge in terms of how to mainly statistically analyze such studies, how to conduct them, and how to analyze them. And then as a third category, we decided on calling these tools very specific approaches, such as targeted learning for causal effect estimation, or the evaluation of confounded treatment effects. Each of these projects and others that are not shown on this slide are in different stages of maturation. Our website is updating as they finish and as they publish, so please stay tuned. Again, a rising tide lifts all boats, and we're pleased to be doing our part to improve clarity. And I will also add in this venue that if some projects don't seem like quote unquote home runs, I would take that as a positive sign. If all of our projects are successes, then we're not taking enough risks. But I think our batting average is higher than most major league players' batting averages. I'll stop with my baseball stuff here. And I only have one slide as an example, and this was one of the earliest major projects that came across the finish line. This is from 2023, emulation of randomized trials with non-randomized database analyses. The conclusions are that real-world evidence studies can reach similar conclusions as RTTs when design and measurements can be closely emulated. But this may be difficult to achieve. Concordance in results vary depending on agreement metric. Emulation differences, chance, and residual confounding can contribute to divergence in results and are difficult to disentangle. There's a lot more richness in the article, but I could be, again, somewhat informal by saying two things. One is that this project might be viewed as addressing the question at the time of, isn't a broken clock correct twice a day, i.e. don't observational studies just by happenstance occasionally get it right. But the second thing is what I said earlier, the Drug Outcome Association exists. We have to be thoughtful about how we approach it. If we do it right, it's not going to be possible under all circumstances, but there will be opportunities for using real-world evidence, even non-randomized real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. But there's no free lunch. It's not, we don't want to fall victim to the disillusionment part of the hype cycle, but rather get past that trough and be on the slope of enlightenment. Okay, at the same time, separate from funded projects, we've tried to do our part on an ongoing basis in our spare time to publish beyond guidances with some insights into what FDA is thinking or what we're thinking individually. In 2019, the write-up on the evidence framework, a commitment to engagement and transparency, I think that's been delivered on. In 2020, randomized observational, interventional, and real world, what's in a name? That was to try to demystify some of the confusion that's lesser now, but still exists. We talked about a use of a transplant drug that I'll mention in more detail shortly. We updated Where Are We Now, which generated that figure that I showed earlier. And then we dove into the weeds to try to correct the misunderstanding of how often real-world evidence is used by FDA. We focused on neuroscience-related new drugs and biologics license applications. And most recently, when can real-world data generate real-world evidence? Again, getting at that taxonomy of what is and what isn't real-world evidence for our purposes with respect to Congress asking us to report on a regular basis. We don't just stay internal or based on the 50 states. We do have external collaborations. This slide shows on the left the ICH-M14 for pharmacoepidemiologic studies of safety. Again, this predates 21st Century Cures, a good reminder that what we do now in real-world evidence for safety has existed, but nonetheless, it's a nice parallel to what's on the right-hand side, which is the ICH reflection paper on real-world evidence for effectiveness. So part of the challenge, this has been approved by the ICH Management Committee. Part of the challenge will be the dividing line between safety and effectiveness, but I would be optimistic that good epidemiologic and scientific principles transcend these other labels. So please stay tuned as that process and activity evolves. Here's an example. Again, I'll say more about it after showing this slide in the next, but you may have seen this before. Prograf tacrolimus was approved for prophylaxis of organ rejection for liver and later for kidney and heart based on traditional RCT evidence, and the drug is used widely in clinical care. RCTs, actually, it's not that none were conducted, but none were conducted and submitted to FDA. The sponsor later on submitted a supplemental NDA and to FDA with a non-interventional study. We evaluated the data and design according to our existing standards, and we approved the drug for preventing rejection or death for lung transplants in 2021. Here's a little bit of what you get by looking under the hood. Why were the data fit for use? Well, the data were from the US Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients on all lung transplants during the period shown, and they were collected with standard analysis files. To translate, generalizability unsurpassed, which is nice. But more importantly, for drug approval, the validity was just as good. The relevance and reliability were just as good as what would have been collected if a clinical trial were done. The design was not a clinical trial. It's a non-observational treatment, non-interventional observational treatment arm compared to historical controls. An analysis plan and the patient level data, important regulatory conduct aspects were submitted to FDA. We determined using existing regulations, 314.126, I didn't memorize it, I learned it when I joined, to determine this study to satisfy the adequate and well-controlled evidentiary standard for effectiveness. So this is the first time that CDER used that approach for an observational study. And I will say everything was up to snuff, but it's also true that the outcomes of rejection and death are virtually certain to occur without therapy. So that dramatic effect of treatment helps to preclude bias as an explanation of results. We do not have a hazard ratio or relative risk threshold, but the more the signal, the point estimate is weak, the more we would worry, anyone would worry about bias being an explanation for results. Not everything is quite as, say, prominent as the Prograf example, but I think that drops in the bucket fill that bucket over time. We reported this in our a public report of RWE that I'll mention shortly, but an alternative loading dose for lacosamide treatment in partial onset seizures for the patients with age ranges shown was approved. The primary focus here again is on safety, but the fact is it was a retrospective cohort study and electronic health records are the data source. So it's a matter of just official bookkeeping purposes. This is real world evidence. And I think what I'm trying to convey is there's a spectrum. So the tool has to be right for the job, and not everything will be as dramatic as Prograf. And maybe if you, in a context where the data aren't fit for use, think twice about using it. It's not just an automatic, we are open for business for any study design and any data source, but it has to meet our requirements. And here I'm catching up with the Prescription Drug User Fee Act 7 for fiscal years 2023 through 2027. This slide shows the prospective view from the time that it was approved. By the end of 2022, we should establish an advancing real-world evidence program to identify approaches for RWE that meet regulatory requirements. Rather than go through the whole slide, I'll take it one at a time. We did establish that program. We've had 4 successful cycles. Please stay tuned. To protect confidentiality, we're not reporting on an individual basis. Rather, we're compiling our experience. And I know this is dangling a worm. I wouldn't put a publication in preparation on my CV, but I will say there's something cooking in the background. So there'll be more on the Advancing RWE program soon. By June 30th of 2024, we will report aggregate data on an annual basis. We met that commitment, and that's where the VIMPAT example can be found, among others. By the end of next year, we will convene a public workshop or meeting to discuss case studies. We may or may not be back in this venue. I may or may not be here, but we will do the job. And then by the end of 2026, we will update existing or generate new RWE-related guidance documents, and we have a plan in place for that as well. Now, if some folks are in the audience, or maybe some that aren't in the audience because they're not only not interested in real-world evidence, but very skeptical about it, let me be clear, it's not easy to do it right. This is an informal compilation of things that we see commonly. It's not an official list. It's certainly not a checklist, but dividing as per our framework document into data being fit for use, design being adequate, and conduct being appropriate. Let's take this one at a time. Real-world data sources are sometimes not fit for use. There are issues with reliability or relevance, reliability, accuracy, completeness, traceability, relevance, having the right covariates, having enough patients when all the matching is done to still have something to work with. Missing or mistimed data. By mistimed, we mean we don't fault clinicians at the bedside for not collecting the data on, say, a Q6-month, Q12-month interval that a trial might want. So how do we handle that? Problems with the endpoint or the practical need for linkage to other data sources. In terms of the design and interpretation, sometimes that's inadequate. Of course, confounding is always a problem, but it should not be the miasma of our century. we have to address confounding and see whether or not it's been adequately addressed or not. I would say on par with confounding is, and underappreciated, is problems with the index data or zero time, e.g. immortal time bias, a problem when you don't have a randomized design, and that could be underappreciated as a problem, or the plain use of an inappropriate comparator, even if it's the best you have. And then conduct of non-randomized studies, sometimes they don't adhere to regulations, protocol and analysis plan. It's not so much that we are obsessive, but it's not for obsessiveness sake per se. I know I say this too often, but with an observational study and a database, you can do 99 analyses, get non-significant p-values, play with the covariates and get a p-value of 0.049 and say, I think I'll submit that to FDA. I mean, that's an exaggerated example, but that's what we're trying to be cognizant of in general. And then lack of access to patient-level data or ability to inspect RWD sources, which we need to do to be comfortable with our decision and also to do maybe some sensitivity analyses ourselves. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to looking forward with the few minutes I have remaining. Again, I've mentioned this before, but please take this under advisement. If you disagree, shoot me an email. I'm happy to engage in a discussion, if not a debate. But RWD and RWE are not new scientific concepts. In reality, sources of data and study design haven't changed. It's the access to the data that are evolving and they're becoming more relevant and reliable for good reasons. And the second conception I said earlier, a simple dichotomy of RCTs versus observational studies. I guess you could make it, certainly those two types of study design are separate, but in reality, clinical trials are defined by assignment of treatment according to an investigational protocol. And the main point here is single-arm trials face challenges similar to those of observational studies in determining whether differences in clinical outcomes compared to an external control group represent actual treatment effects. In fact, in some forums, I've been approached to say that some folks have more confidence in observational cohort studies than they do in externally controlled trials, despite the trial arm. Why? Because you have the same source population for both. When you compare a single-arm trial to an external control arm, there could be such fundamental differences that aren't appreciated or accounted for that you can get the wrong answer. I have my summary here. So if I've been clear, hopefully you appreciate that in addition to the randomized trial paradigm, availability of big data and passage of the 21st Century Cures Act reflect and contributed to the emergence of real-world evidence. Our FDA program for drugs and biologics is advancing as outlined in the framework from 2018, including guidance demonstration projects and others activities that I've mentioned. Whether based on clinical trials or observational studies and with or without real-world data, please appreciate FDA approves drugs and biological products using existing evidentiary standards, and we're comfortable doing so. Now, normally a summary would come last, but in deference to Dr. Cargan-Karai, I have this slide afterwards. I think this paragraph has aged well, but it's about to be updated. The FDA remains committed to robust policy development aligned with the Cures Act while maintaining evidentiary standards and honoring our obligation to protect and promote the public health. Focusing on the distinction between interventional and non-interventional studies can help researchers, sponsors, and regulators better understand and describe methodologic issues. So let's all together gain more experience, including by lessons learned from the conduct of rigorous non-interventional studies to help advance drug development. There are too many people to thank, but this acknowledgement slide again covers the Office of Medical Policy, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, the Oncology Center of Excellence, the Commissioner's Office. We have a matrix arrangement where we bring who we need to the table in search of promoting the appropriate use of real-world evidence. With that, I'll say thank you very much. If there are any questions that don't get answered, please use that email address as shown, but I'll turn things over to Jacqueline. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's always hard to follow you when we're talking about real-world evidence, but I'll do my best. So I want to thank everyone again for being here in person and also online. And we're going to talk about CDER's real-world evidence program. And in particular, what I want to talk about is the launch of CDER's Center for Real-World Evidence Innovation. And so what do I mean? So why are we doing this? Why are we thinking we need a different organizational structure? Why do we need a new innovation center? First of all, what we've been doing has worked well. I think John has gone over that. But we increasingly see complexity and new submissions, data, use of emerging technologies with the data, such as AI and digital health tools. And so we need to sort of take this into account as we think about how we can have more evidence generation to support regulatory decisions from real world evidence. We want to really move into realizing the full potential of RWD in CDER's decisions on efficacy and safety. And so a more centralized structure where we're really bringing everyone together and defining our next strategic objectives to promote consistent scientific review and knowledge management and coordinate our research goals and engage, of course, externally, very important. And so our goals is to promote efficiency, consistency, and with that, CDER leadership and the Office of Medical Policy are launching this new innovation center. Our vision is to optimize the use of real-world data to inform the effectiveness and safety of drugs and biological products within CDER. And we'll do that by advancing that evaluation and addressing any of those regulatory science and policy-related issues, and to define our priorities and communicate them and interact with you on those. So we will be developing a strategic plan. We had the 2018 framework, and it's time to say what's next for us. We've done a lot of what we laid out in that framework in terms of guidances and research. So we want to advance appropriate use of real world data to generate RWE that meets those standards. We want to improve and enhance our inter-office communication. We have a lot now, but we want to make sure that we're maximizing that, promote that collaboration with our other centers that we work closely with, and most importantly, and it's last on the list, but not the least important, is to make sure we're talking to you and learning from you. Some of the focus of our activities will look familiar. These are some of the things we're doing now. Scientific review and policy is certainly very important. Engagement with the center staff on any submissions that come in, as well as looking at what we've done in guidance, updating it and generating new guidances as needed. We want to coordinate our research and outreach and engagement, make sure we're getting out there enough, getting our message out, engaging through workshops, symposium, and other meetings with individuals. Our research, you've heard about our research portfolio. We'll continue to promote research focused on regulatory science questions that are most relevant, and then make sure we're disseminating them. And although we already have some knowledge management, we think that there's more to be done so that we make sure our reviewers are very aware of all the things that is coming out of this program, and that we do as much training as possible. This is just a sort of straw man for the structure, but we've launched a national search for a new CCRI director, and there will be an advisory board that will be for the leadership of all of the offices at CDER that are involved with RWE. And then there will be, of course, oversight over all these areas to bring us together. But importantly, what we really want to do is understand, what we've done. You've heard about it this morning or this afternoon, but we'd like to hear what you think we should be focusing on in all these areas. And so when we announced this public workshop, we also put out a docket and asked, what are those critical issues? What are the research priorities? What are the guidance topics? And the comment period ends on January 13th. So I want to thank you. And I guess we'll take a little time to answer some questions. Is that right?
Thank you both very much. Exciting stuff. New CDER Center for RWE Innovation, CCRI. John, maybe I'll start with you. Can you talk a little bit more about how this is going to differ from how CDER does things now?
Yes, the scope of CCRI is aligned with I will expand on ongoing CEDAR-based activities, evaluating the use of real-world evidence, of course, to support a new indication for an already approved drug or to support post-market safety requirements. Relevant technology-based innovations to further those goals, such as AI and digital health technologies, will also be addressed. And our colleague, Dr. Tala Fakuri, is on the panel session 1 this afternoon to sort of point out that overlap. There's independent AI activities and AI council, but there needs to be strong links and communication between the two. Jacqueline, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think what we really do, we're going to focus on what can CEDAR do in the regulatory space and the scientific space to make sure that we're really advancing the use of RWE in CEDAR decision-making. And, you know, it is a center, and there's all sorts of centers, right? There's the Center for Drugs, and then there's Center of Excellence, and there's others. But I think what you want to focus on here is the innovation. I think that's what we really want to focus on. How do we continue to innovate in this area? And I would also stress that although we're focused on what CEDAR can do, we really understand, and we're going to continue to work very closely with our colleagues in CBER and CDRH and the Oncology Center of Excellence. They're important partners as we push innovation and we try and learn from each other in what we're doing to make sure that we're doing all that we can do in this area.
Okay. So several interesting things to unpack there, but I think you've highlighted that there'll be some additional sessions like with Tala and AI, et cetera. So maybe I'll save some of that for a bit later. Anything that you can share with us, and Jacqueline, maybe I'll start with you, about why now? You know, launching an office is significant. So any thoughts about why now and what priorities are going to come first?
Yeah, so first of all, it's not an office, it's an organizational structure to take what we're doing and really focus it and be very strategic. So you know, in terms of that structure, that's not an office, that's a reporting, you know, how it really, that leadership is going to be involved, this director is going to be involved, that advisory panel is all the office leaders that are involved right now, but, you know, really to come together and think strategically. And as I said, it's just, we see greater complexity. There's more, you know, there's always been interest, but I think there's a lot of work on improving the reliance and reliability of data, using technology so that we can really get at that data and analyze that. And so I think we want to, it's also time, as I said, we had done the framework, and I think John has carried out and sort of done everything under that framework and more. And it's time to really think about what's next for us in this area.
Fair.
I agree with everything you said, Jacqueline. It takes a huge team to get the job done. In terms of timing, just to restate what Jacqueline said, I think the program is nowhere near what it could be in the future, but it has matured enough based on the 2018 framework. So now what we've done is, informally speaking again, cut a path through the woods in terms of communication, but now we should pave that path so that there are easier ways to communicate across. So it's really an overlay. It's a structure on top of what's existing. This is not a new center that's going to be making fundamental changes. It can make fundamental progress, but not immediate changes. So it's really will allow for efficient and consistent communication across CEDAR offices and within CEDAR offices and outside of CEDAR. And I just want to repeat what Jacqueline had on one of the figures. This is another informal taxonomy, but we have the work streams as currently conceptualized of scientific review and policy, outreach and engagement, research initiatives, and knowledge management. That's a simple but cogent way of trying to organize the landscape. So we'll have existing staff doing double duty. Their day jobs overlaps already, but their day job will include a new baseball hat that says CCRI.
I appreciate it. It is cogent. It is building on a lot of efforts over the last many years. And yeah, almost paving over kind of walked paths. I appreciate that. Going back to something you said, Jacqueline, a moment ago, can you talk a little bit more about coordination with CBER, with CDRH, with OCE? You're right. There's large organizations, disparate activities, so much going on. Can you share a little bit more about the coordination?
Sure. So, you know what I think as we make sure that CEDAR is all sort of aligned and we have our priorities, I think it becomes more efficient as we sort of speak with one voice. But certainly they're going to be at the table. There's no, this is CCRI and then CCRI interacts. I mean, we're all going to be talking together and working on things because any policy development that we might do is very relevant for CBER and the oncology and CDRH. And so, you know, those conversations will continue, but I think when we, you know, we're a pretty big organization. There's a lot of work going on in this area. So making sure we're bringing it together, we're being strategic, and then we're really talking together with our colleagues and making sure we reach alignment as best we can. And we may not align on everything, and that's fine, as long as we can sort of explain where we align, where we don't align, and why.
Yeah, I would echo that. The pieces of the puzzle are on the table already. It's just putting them together in a way that allows for more efficient communication. Like right now, we listed publications. A lot of groups in CEDAR and outside of CEDAR and CBER and OCE are generating publications. If we have a structure that allows us to become familiar with that, I think we're speaking with one voice to a large extent, but we could always improve and polish and be more efficient in doing so. So that's just one example in one of the 4 work streams where the CCRI could help.
Right, it's a complex set of issues. It's a never-ending range of applications, interests, data sources, et cetera. Yeah, the coordination across the various centers. It won't always be easy, simplified, full agreement, et cetera.
Yeah.
But the model of trying to bring so many people together is a wonderful one. Okay, one of the things that we talked about, John, when we began planning this meeting was like, it's kind of similar to the lines of what's now, what's different, et cetera. And I thought you did a really eloquent job of talking about the inflection point of there has been an enormous amount of guidance development that's been done, et cetera, over the last several years. There's been an enormous amount of mandates and PDUFA commitments, et cetera. But it was pretty exciting to hear you talk about, and I think, Jacqueline, you've done a nice job of this too, kind of this inflection point of solidifying and building upon what we've had, et cetera. Can you talk about, start with whomever would like, what are you most excited about now moving forward? I mean, RWE in drug development for regulatory decision-making. Are there initial apples that you're most excited to kind of, you know, continue plucking or new ones?
Yeah, it's either an inflection point or not to endorse the Gardner hype cycle, but I trust we're on the slope of enlightenment on our way to the plateau of productivity. But since my talk was looking back a bit, I'll link my comments to the, you know, about the future to the past as well as the present. In my 5 years at FDA, I have seen a shift. I was originally going to say attitudes, but I would say it's more of awareness. There's always a distribution of where one comes from based on their training, experience, education. But I think just the fact that there's more awareness of what this real-world evidence, real-world data stuff is in and of itself very, very helpful. And as mentioned, I think it's just fair to say the RWE program, again, too many people to thank, those that came before us, those that come after us, you know, and those that got the work done in this, say, 5 or 6 year period, worked very hard to meet our congressional mandates and our PDUFA 6, as well as early 7 commitments. And that's a nice thing to be able to say. But more importantly, it's those commitments and mandates are meaningful. They're not just checking of boxes on the page. I think it's most important that we've shown that we can approve drugs even for effectiveness, for new indications, using our existing regulations. And we're not twisting ourselves in knots to do so. It's amazing how well the regulations have withstood the test of time, even though they never anticipated the current era. And that's a credit to our predecessors in that sense. And again, I mentioned the awareness along with the attitudes. I think it's clear that RWD and RWE, I'm using those, I'll put air quotes around them, are becoming integrated into the daily operations, say in the Office of New Drug Divisions. Not every division you encounter is as familiar, but they're all highly talented, highly educated, smart people. And we have a system in place that helps them when some demystification of RWD, RWE might be needed. So I'm optimistic, more than cautiously, I'm just plain optimistic that if we call this the first generation of effort from say 2016, 2018 to now, we're poised. I'll go back to, I'll now invoke the inflection point from Garrett to say that we can look forward to a second generation. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I agree with you, John. I mean, I think, you know, a lot we were building and you know, we just got out the guidances on the designs and we're getting the feedback and we're getting that back. And we understand that a lot of times in drug development, you know, our stakeholders are waiting to see what we think about things. And so we're hoping, you know, now that more of how we think about this is out and then sort of announcing the center and being very, direct and having strategic will start to just increase the number of, opportunities there are to use real world evidence, as well as to capitalize on new technologies. What can AI tell us? What can digital tools? Can we be more creative? Can we also, I think, John, you talked a lot about observational studies. We also talk about, more point of care trials and just maximizing the use and doing the designs that work. I mean, that's what we see, in the sort of demonstration project that's being done under C3TI, which is bringing the real world evidence group in to say, well, how do you get that real world data if you want to do that point of care trial and make that, a success?
Two quick follow-up points. One is
Please.
that please pick the right tool for the job. I know that's a cliche, but that works well. Secondly is that this is a horrible oversimplification or a massive one, but C3TI is to clinical trials, what CCRI is to non-randomized studies. And there's overlap, a healthy overlap of two circles on a Venn diagram, but in a way you can think of them as parallel efforts to try to make them more efficient and consistent and promote innovation at the same time. Innovation is in both titles.
Right.
And the last thing I'll say is that, without being cryptic, I let leadership know many, many months ago, well before November, that I plan to retire after 32 years of federal service, 5 at the FDA. And it's been my pleasure and privilege to help plan the CCRI, but we'll be turning things over to a to-be identified new leader of CCRI going forward. And I wish them and the entire team well. I have total confidence that great things will happen.
So a couple of things.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's why I said we are, and I should have said it after you said that, but I slipped, and John has just done incredible, and it'll be hard to replace. We hope that maybe we can work out a way to still get his advice in the future. We'll see how that goes.
We're working on it. Congress has to go out.
But yes, we need someone full-time, and we'll give John a little bit of a rest. That green light won't be on all the time. And,
So
as we move forward.
the two of you have stolen my thunder in two regards. So
Sorry.
yes. So in the audience, I appreciate that they beat my prompt to the applause. So a bit of inside baseball as we were planning this and looking forward to this first session. John at one point asked the question. He wasn't quite sure if he should present or if Jacqueline or somebody else this, that, and the other. And our entire internal team, at least at Duke Margolis, said, "Oh, heavens no, John. We need you up there so that folks can give you your flowers." So thank you for beating me to that prompt by giving them to you, John, earlier. And congratulations. And thank you for everything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Hope there is a little bit of quiet time. Look forward to continuing engagement. But so with that first offense now rectified, the second one was you beat me to my last question. So it was March 19th and 20th that there was this big innovative trials meeting that was another Duke Margolis FDA convening. And it wasn't publicly stated then, but it was planning it, knew it was a kind of a soft launch for C3TI. You talked about it a little bit, but do you mind just reiterating or offering any other points on kind of, similarities and differences within C3TI and CCRI, or if there's anything about the early months of C3TI's launch that can inform CCRI's kind of kickoff in the next few months? Anything else to share there? And maybe it's just what you all said before.
Well, so C3TI is for the clinical trial innovation. And one of the things that its goals was to do was there was a lot of different places. So RWE was one. There's, model involved drug development. There's complex innovative design. And so the thought was there's all these, different programs. And for someone coming in, we wanted to have sort of a one-stop shop where we could sort of direct you to the right place, but then go beyond that and promote innovation. And part of that was, doing the demonstration projects. But RWE was seen as one of those innovation centers that, was brought in and that C3TI would work on, and that will continue to be the case. And I think what C3TI has done very, very well, and I've been involved, is really communicating and doing some of the things we're talking about in terms of internal, communication, promotion of innovation, keeping that message externally. I think that demonstration projects are a great idea. I mean, we have in PDUFA, we already have what's equivalent to a demonstration project for RWE, but we certainly will learn lessons from that and continue to work with them. So it will be it'll be CCRI as part of C3GI, just to confuse everyone.
No shortage of acronyms. No,
Yeah,
I agree with
exactly.
everything Jacqueline said. I would think that there were more similarities and differences, and the differences are modest. And a lot of them, I mean, that's where the landscape differences are obvious. Like it's a traditional clinical trial, it's C3GI. If it's a non-interventional study, it's more likely CCRI, and we're more than willing to deal with some gray zone where we have to sort things out and make sure we're not duplicating or giving, discordant feedback. But a good problem to have, as they say.
It is a good problem to have. A great distinction also that you finished with. Okay, so we have finished a few minutes early, but I am just fine with that because as I always recognize when I'm in a meeting like this, there's a bit of a almost reunion party element to it in between the CCRI discussions, between people I'm sure wanting to give you a pat on the back, John. I am happy to break a few minutes early. I believe we come back at 1:50 for our next session. But before we do pause, a couple things I should have noted earlier. I believe for those folks online, a link was released to CCRI. Also, obviously, we'll continue to promote the docket as an opportunity to provide information. But there's lots, from what I understand, there's a lot of material in the background that folks are going to have to be able to access, learn more, ask questions, et cetera. And then when we come back at 1:50, one of the first things that we'll do is put the Slido QR code up so that folks online can submit questions. Moderators will work them in. Also, obviously, as I mentioned before, for those afternoon sessions, we'll be running mics if folks just want to kind of hop up and ask us directly here. But I think that's it for me now, beyond offering my sincere thanks and congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, welcome back from the break. I hope it was a nice long networking break for all of you. And we're glad that many of you have rejoined us as we introduce our next session, which is session 1, focused on opportunities and challenges and using real world data and evidence. So for this session, we're going to dive a little deeper into topics related to real-world data utilization. We're going to talk about some promising opportunities and challenges, some potential solutions even that exist within the current landscape across practitioners, regulators, and so forth. We're also going to discuss the role of artificial intelligence, or AI, in this space, and some collaborative approaches to real-world data sourcing and curation. We're going to touch a little bit on where we're seeing some emerging consensus among regulators, particularly around key topics that you've already heard today, particularly in John Concato's presentation around challenges associated with establishing or measuring or operationalizing key fit for purpose terms like relevance and reliability of real world data. So that said, again, we're thrilled you all are here to dive into this discussion with us. We have several panelists here with us, and they're all seated here in order that you see on the agenda. So first we have Tala Fakhouri, who is the Associate Director for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, or AI, in the Office of Medical Policy at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, at the FDA. Next, we have Donna Rivera, who is the Associate Director for Pharmacoepidemiology in the FDA's Oncology Center for Excellence. Next, we have Julia Luan, who is the Executive Regulatory Science Director at AstraZeneca. Next, we have Nicole Mahoney, who is also an Executive Director for Regulatory Affairs at Novartis. Last but not least, we are joined by Dan Riskin, who is the founder and CEO of Verantos and also clinical professor at Stanford University. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it to my panelists to provide each 5-minute opening remarks for everyone to think about and process as we From there, move into a moderated discussion, followed by that, an open discussion with our in-person and online audience. So definitely feel free to generate questions that come up in your mind and save them for the discussion portion of this session. And I will go ahead and be seated here as I turn it to Tala to provide some opening remarks.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I could talk for more than 5 minutes, but I'll try to summarize what I think is probably important when it comes to AI and this overlap between AI and RWD. AI has the potential to accelerate the development of safe and effective drugs. I think we're going through these the hype cycles for different types of AI, but a lot of the useful tools are actually on that plateau of productivity, and we've seen them being used for many years now. AI can be used across the spectrum of drug development. It can be used in discovery in areas that are outside of FDA's oversight, but also in non-clinical research, in clinical research. And when we talk about that, usually we mean clinical trials or studies that are conducted in humans, also in post-market safety surveillance and in manufacturing. This is what's happening that we see happening in the wild, right? But we also see that reflected in regulatory submissions to the agency. So from 2016 until today, CDER has received over 500 regulatory submissions with AI components. The vast majority are machine learning technologies that are on that on the productivity scope or slope of the Gartner hype cycle. And some of these submissions are related to RWD. A few are used to generate real-world evidence from real-world data. If you remember that slide that Dr. John Concato showed, looking at the reliance on RWD across the spectrum of different types of studies, we actually see these uses across that spectrum. So in a traditional clinical trial, AI can be used to identify sites where a sponsor may be most lucky in recruiting participants because these sites have high response rates, right? This is one use that has been around for a while, and this is using RWD not to generate real-world evidence, but that's where AI is being used. If you look at now moving on to the next part of the reliance on RWD into, I think the next one was RCTs that are conducted in clinical settings. AI is a really powerful tool for EHR phenotyping, right? That is one common use that we also see. Then you move to the right and you look at external control arms. AI can help construct external control arms. AI can also be used to simulate placebo response and create things that sometimes people refer to as digital twins. That is also something that we've seen in regulatory submissions. And then finally, in non-interventional studies, the uses there are varied. One promising use is AI in targeted maximum likelihood estimation to enhance the estimation of causal effects. We also see causal AI come into under the spotlight to say when it comes to generating evidence for safety and effectiveness of a drug. This is all to say AI is a tool that can be applied to real-world data to generate evidence. But some of the conditions that are needed to make RWD become RWE successful are the same conditions for AI to be successful. AI tools learn on data. A lot of the time, that data is real-world data. We need that data to be good data, or what we refer to as fit-for-use data. So these same conditions for when is RWD of high quality, let's say, apply for when you're trying to develop artificial intelligence tools. We hear a lot about there's not enough good data or fit-for-use data. Some argue that there is a lot of good data, it just sits in silos. We need to increase access to that good data. But I would also argue that we need to think ahead in the future. How do we actually collect data that is fit for use? that is representative, that is complete, or has enough key elements that are needed for us to answer the questions that we're trying to answer. That's the first condition. The second condition for success is the need for multi-fluency and multidisciplinary collaboration. A lot of the people who develop these tools are not probably sitting in the room. They're not clinicians. They're not epidemiologists. They're engineers or data scientists or computer scientists. They speak a very different language. So even when we're talking about things like relevant and reliable data, they don't use these same terms. We need to bring these people into the ecosystem and make them full partners and not an afterthought, because this is how we can truly effectively apply this technology to accelerate the development of drugs.
Wonderful.
Was that 5 minutes? Probably longer.
Well, it was,
All right.
it's 5 minutes well spent. Thank you so much for those opening remarks. Very thought-provoking. Next, we will turn it to Dana Rivera, who will provide her opening remarks for this session.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. It's delightful to be here. So building on what Tala said and moving in the direction more specifically of real-world data and real-world evidence, I want to echo some of the comments and discussion that came earlier from Dr. Concato in highlighting the fact that the FDA has recently released several RWE guidances led by OMP as a cross-agency contributing efforts around data, including the EHR and claims guidance, which moved to final, and of course in design, as you're seeing a variety of design guidances, as we see a variety of evolving designs coming through in regulatory review, in those guidances, including non-interventional studies, externally controlled trials, point of care, and decentralized trials. And so within that context, within the Oncology Center of Excellence, we are working closely with our across-agency collaborators to really apply the principles of these guidances in our review. So a little bit about OCE. The Oncology Center of Excellence established the Oncology Real-World Evidence Program, and that program supports the Office of Oncologic Diseases in CDER, which has a vast amount of regulatory applications and focuses on collaboratively advancing the appropriate use of real-world evidence in oncology product development. And to that point, within our program, the team has conducted over 200 consults of oncology drugs, devices, and biologics that include the use of real-world data and real-world evidence across CBER, CDER, and CDRH, so across drugs, biologics, and devices. And within that, our approach to review is also synergistic with our approach to research. So we're trying to integrate and advance knowledge through this synergistic approach of evolving thinking, right? I think we're learning so much as things come in throughout the agency, and it's a very exciting scientific prospect, and I think as we all work together collaboratively, really great to be a part of. And there's a lot of research going on in novel projects around RWD methods, as well as mentioned, the reliance on fit-for-use data and the importance of transparency principles that also apply to AI as we think a lot about designing studies. I would say across the agency, our goal, or one of our goals, is around modernizing evidence generation. And one way we do that is understanding how real-world data can be applied for regulatory purposes. And that does span a continuum in the generation of real-world evidence, as well as utilization in prospective approaches, such as in pragmatic clinical trials. And one of those examples, one of those, I think, really important aspects to think about is data quality. I think data quality is paramount, and in so many aspects of high quality studies, it's that necessity on fit for use data, on relevant and reliable data, and on high quality data, which is why in oncology, we're thinking a lot about the development of prospective registries and ways in which we think about the use of pragmatic elements in clinical trials. How are we thinking about not only improving the conduct of retrospective studies, but also ways in which we can build prospective high quality data that can then inform regulatory decision making. So I'd say the continuum of potential uses for real data is vast, And the premise is always that they're methodologically sound, that they're fit for use, and that ultimately they can derive insights that provide patient benefit. And so we think a lot about, of course, with clinical trials being the gold standard, that it's not a dichotomy of, do we use real world data, do we not? But how can we use real world data to better generate real world evidence where trials can face challenges? How can we complement the knowledge that we have and then highlight the examples of where we have seen and demonstrated approaches that real world data can become real world evidence and support regulatory approvals? Which really leads me to my last point, which is around shared responsibility. I think in general, the role of evidence generation, and specifically of pragmatic evidence generation, of use of real data, of use in externally controlled trials, all of these in our methodological responsibility, as well as our general ecosystem responsibility, is shared. And I think it's not just shared among regulators, but also as sponsors, payers, providers, to create more patient-centric evidence generation. And I think as things become increasingly more technology enabled, and as we're able to have better quality data resources, it's not necessarily a question of if, it's a question of how, with the limited resources that are available and the abundant number of scientific questions we need to answer and the evidence we need, how we can all move the field forward together.
Wonderful, wonderfully said. Tala, you talked a bit about, the Gartner hype cycle and, us, being part of that cycle. I mean, real world evidence is not immune to any hype cycle by any means. And, to your point, as we think about even some of the hardships that we face in conducting clinical trials, specifically randomized control trials as that gold standard approach, what are opportunities in front of us, to think about real world evidence, technological enablement, our era of big data that we're in, how can we bring it all together in order to get out of any trough of disillusionment we might find ourselves in along that hype cycle and reach that scope of enlightenment. I really like that. So thank you both for your first two opening remarks. And next, I will turn it to our next panelist. Julia, please go right ahead.
Hi. Hello, everyone. I want to emphasize one thing from my past experience is prior to joining AstraZeneca, I worked in the FDA CDER Office of Biostatistics for 13 years. So I'm very passionate about data. And given my background, I deeply understand garbage in and garbage out. So data quality is actually the cornerstone of our work. And no matter how advanced our data curation techniques and analytical methods are, they cannot compensate for poor data quality. Unfortunately, I think there is a broad consensus across different agencies and the pharmaceutical industry regarding the importance of data reliability and relevance. And in addition, I think there's a general agreement on the underlying principles of data reliability and relevance. However, variations do exist in how data reliability and relevance are interpreted and enforced. And these differences often stem from distinct regional regulatory requirements and health priorities and legislative frameworks. And we know currently there are significant global harmonization efforts aiming to align on terminology and standards. In the next few minutes, I want to share a real-life example with you to illustrate that the regulators are very supportive of the RWE studies with reliable and relevant data for indication-seeking purposes. And this example is DAPA-MI. It's available on clinicaltrials.gov. And in addition, the design paper and the results paper have been published. Actually, yesterday, there is a Pink Sheet article about this trial. If you're interested, you can take a look. And based on the original design, DAPA-MI is the world's first indication-seeking registry-based RCT. I'm the global regulatory lead for this trial. In the second session, I believe Professor Stephen James will discuss the design in great detail. And here I will talk about this study focusing on its regulatory acceptability and the data quality. And as you know, dapagliflozin is AstraZeneca's blockbuster drug. It was initially approved in 2012 for diabetes. And then we secured indications for heart failure and chronic kidney disease. And now it has been approved in more than 120 countries. The objective of this DAPA-MI trial is to evaluate the effect of dapagliflozin in post-MI population. And based on the original design, 6,400 subjects are randomized to DAPA arm and the placebo arm, and from 50 centers in Sweden and 50 centers in UK. And two high-quality registries, Sweden Sweetheart and UK MINEP, are used to identify, enroll, randomize, and follow up patients. From November 2019 to October 2020, we had 5 formal regulatory interactions to discuss the original design with the agencies, including UK MHRA, US FDA, Sweden MPA, Germany BfArM, and the EMA. All 5 agencies are very supportive of the RRCT concept and agreed with major design elements. And especially despite the absence of US subjects in this study, the FDA granted DAPA-MI fast track designation and a special protocol assessment agreement. After DAPA-MI was completed early this year, we had informal meetings with the FDA and MPA to share learnings from DAPA-MI. During our FDA meeting, almost 20 FDA senior leaders attended this event, including Dr. Jacqueline Corrigan-Curie and Dr. John Concado. On October 31st, we were invited to the FDA White Oak campus to present DAPA-MI at the FDA CDER Center for Clinical Trial Innovation scientific round to discuss this RRCT DAPA-MI design. And we are very proud that we are the first industry speakers that C3TI invited to this scientific round. There are great learnings from this trial. For example, the recruitment speed is about 50% higher than the comparable RCTs. The estimated purpose and the cost is reduced by approximately 16 to 32% due to fewer visits and fewer assessments, which actually reduce patient and the site burden. So it's very patient-centric drug development. One thing I want to highlight is that the data quality of DAPA-MI is very high because we use 2 population-based registries, high-quality registries to collect data. Our data are accurate, complete, and traceable. And the missing data is only 2 to 3% and significantly lower than the comparable RCTs. And this example actually demonstrates that registry-based RCT studies are able to provide high-quality data comparable to RCTs, maybe even better than RCTs in some aspects. And lastly, I want to highlight or point out is that, RWE studies are often used for oncology and rare diseases, but DAPA-MI is an RWE study in common disease areas. So I think I used up my time, and I will stop here. If you have any questions, happy to discuss during the Q&A and the break. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, very thought-provoking, and I'm sure our audience members are already thinking of questions. I obviously have a few prepared as we move into the discussion part of this session. But before we do that, we have a few more opening remarks. So Nicole Mahoney, please go right ahead.
Thanks a lot. So I'm Nicole Mahoney. I'm with the Regulatory Policy Group at Novartis, and I just want to give you a little context of the way that I'm viewing and my company is viewing real-world data and evidence, and probably will be providing a little bit of a different perspective on the same topics that we just heard about, namely data quality. That's where I want to focus. And in my role, I have a twofold responsibility. One is to help my company and my product teams really understand the regulatory policy landscape and the existing guidance and how regulators are interpreting it with respect to real-world data and real-world evidence. I also work on AI. The other thing I do, so that's like internal alignment and understanding of how to interpret current precedent. The other thing that I do is help the company and industry in general respond to consultation opportunities. There's been an awful lot of guidance published by FDA, but also global regulators on real-world data and on real-world data quality. And where we are now is we're in a position to, comment on that guidance, provide input, and we are doing that. But more importantly, figure out how to interpret it and how to implement our workflows in a way that we can meet the regulatory expectations for assessing data to make sure it's reliable and relevant. So that's the lens that I'm bringing to the conversation. And on that note, while there is a lot of guidance out there, most of us are engaged in global drug development, and we do see some differences in the strict terminology that's being used when it comes to reliability and relevance. And so right now, what we're doing, not only within Novartis, but within industry more broadly, is taking a look at these definitions, taking a look at guidance coming from ICH, FDA, EMA, and we're saying, okay, if I want to talk to internal people who have to assess data vendors or data partners and make sure data is reliable, what kind of questions do I have to ask so we know we can meet the regulatory requirements? Or if we are assessing a known or existing data source, what do we have to measure? What are the dimensions or attributes of data that show that it's high enough quality to use for a regulatory purpose? So we're having to take a very close look at the guidance that is available, and we're trying to map it across different regions, acknowledging that there's some terminology that may not be the same. I think conceptually, there's a lot of alignment, and I tend to believe that if regulators were assessing, or really any stakeholder, were assessing the same real-world data, you'd come to a similar conclusion on its quality, but actually implementing that can be a challenge. So as next steps, I might suggest, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk about the future and next steps, I might suggest that we take some time to look and see if there are, in fact, real conceptual gaps across regulatory guidance, figure out maybe a Rosetta Stone for understanding how to map across guidance in a way that all stakeholders can understand, including registry holders or electronic medical record vendors. And then as a next step, once that is kind of done, and maybe that could happen at the ICH level, maybe we can move on to really thinking about how to assess data quality and what needs to be reported in a bit more depth. So what should we be measuring? What are the appropriate metrics and things like that? So happy to be part of that conversation and also field other questions in this space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We're hearing what we heard from both you and Julia, a lot of considerations for fit for use data, how it's defined, relevance, reliability, quality, especially how markers to measure them are demonstrably well or unwell, depending on, whatever use case is in front of you. This is something that we're constantly thinking about within Duke Margolis, within the community. And I think there's opportunity to, appreciate nuance where it's most needed, but then also appreciate differences in opinions or application as far as, where these differences might exist in, those definitions, how to operationalize them and understand why. So, I'm really excited to talk more about that with all of you today as well. But before we conclude our opening remarks, Dan Riskin, we'd love to hear from you. Last but not least.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to talk to the group. I think that I'll take a page from Dr. Kunkata's book and talk a little bit about the past and then a little bit about the future. I've been asked to speak about artificial intelligence, data reliability, and implementation. Thinking back to 2007, at that time, I was a young surgeon at Stanford and on the Obama Health Advisory Committee. There was a 16% EHR adoption. The Institute of Medicine had just come out with a publication on the learning health system. Said, wouldn't it be great if, like other industries, we learned from routine care? And there was such a large gap. At that time, 86% of the clinical care was on paper. There was no scalable compute. The cloud wasn't commercially available. Artificial intelligence was extremely limited. How were we going to learn from routine care at any scale if all this stuff was sitting on paper? Now, a decade later, we were more than 90% EHR adopted. The cloud was out, both from Amazon and Google, and artificial intelligence was starting to be developed into something that was useful. It was a major leap forward. In 2014, working on 21st century cures, we saw challenges that if we created a learning health system, but the data were bad, we would have a garbage in, garbage out problem like you identified. And we would come up with the wrong evidence and we would hurt patients. And so in 21st century cures, the language was added that FDA, one of the most credible agencies in the federal government, would figure it out and start to put out an evidentiary standard for how they would use real world data. It's been a pleasure to watch the evolution. Our work became a demonstration project in 2020 under the TRUST study. The TRUST study was intended to look at the highest quality data compared to lower data reliability and see what impact it had. Can you measure accuracy, completeness, and traceability? How does it influence the believability of the evidence? That was a really high order. At the time, we thought through what is the highest quality we could create. We thought we needed linkage. Every patient in the data set would have claims, pharmacy claims, medical claims, death registry, EHR structured data, EHR unstructured data. We thought we needed curation. EHR unstructured data, we needed to dig into the pieces that were relevant for inclusion, exclusion criteria, exposures, and outcomes. And that needed to be optimized and done at scale. At scale meant we needed to use artificial intelligence technology, and optimization meant we needed to test in every regional health system and achieve certain accuracy levels. That was hard and took us 4 years, and we're just finishing up now. What I can say from this early work is that data reliability does matter. When we pushed up the accuracy from 30% to 80 and 90% and pushed up the completeness and pushed up traceability, we found that we found entirely different patient cohorts in a given disease. And in this case, we used a test bed of asthma. We found the disease subtypes, severe asthma or others. We found different groups of patients. They were much less sick in the imputed cohort. They were much more sick in a cohort derived from administrative data. Looking at a clinical gold standard, they were just different. And as we look at data reliability and say, how do we achieve it? How do we measure accuracy, completeness, and traceability? How much does it matter? Based on at least our work, we can say it matters a lot. Different cohorts, different exposures, different outcomes. There's a lot of work left to do. We're following with a study called Verify that will apply this to an actual use case. We're using label expansion, and we don't know the answers yet. We try our hardest to create high quality data sets, analyze them, and see across a gradient of low to high data reliability how much it matters. But we hope the work informs and augments regulatory guidance to figure out where it matters, where we can save money because it doesn't matter, where we can add all the resources required to protect patients where it really does matter. It's a journey, and we're really enjoying being on it with you. I thank you.
Awesome. When I think about, AI applications or ways in which we can improve real world data and therefore the evidence generated to make it meaningful, translatable, clinically meaningful, I always think about, where can we start where there's, low risk, high value in this approach. And so that said, I have a few questions prepared for our panelists today. I'm going to start with a question that we've touched on a little bit already to some extent, but would love to get each of your opinions on this question to the extent you have one. That is, so we talked a bit about, consensus emerging on the concepts of data reliability and relevance, and how those terms are becoming defined across regulators. To the extent any of you are tracking these things and seeing how it affects your understanding or knowledge in your work. Are you seeing any differences? And again, we're looking at this as well within the Institute. Do you see any differences in the way FDA approaches these concepts compared to other interested parties who might be practitioners, other regulators? What's trending as far as, what you see on the day-to-day, to the extent you are, looking at these things actively? And I'll open it up to anyone who would like to go first, of course.
So I think we're seeing across agencies a consistency on data reliability and relevance. When you go one layer deeper, there isn't as much consistency. Certainly, we're seeing the FDA is very advanced in thinking through secondary use of data. Many other agencies are still working on an RCT-based paradigm and thinking through, are there process measures by which we can improve data collection? Whereas secondary use of data, you really can't do that. In terms of stakeholders that are creating, that are bringing together data and generating evidence, we're seeing highly varied capabilities. Some have a lot of experience working in EHR and claims data, in linkage, in extracting out the pieces. They are seeing the increasing expectations on data quality, accuracy, completeness, and traceability, and they're starting to measure. I will say that some of those groups have been disappointed in what they've found. Sometimes when you measure accuracy, you find, oh shoot, my AI system that I took off the shelf and tried to apply to another health system didn't really work so well. And when you measure it system by system in specific disease areas, sometimes they're a little disappointed. Completeness and traceability, same issue. Traceability we see very much, it shows errors in linkage, errors in upcoding, errors across the board. So I think it highlights the importance of the approach to accuracy and completeness and traceability, and that we have a bit of a long way to go.
For sure. Not to stop anyone else from answering that question. Right ahead.
Can I just add something? Actually, I have a comment, basically for our FDA friends here. So based on the FDA's current data standard, the current guidance, the real world data submissions, they are supposed to follow the data catalog in the FDA website. So basically those catalogs, they are the CDISC standards, right? But the CDISC standards, they are developed based on for clinical trials. And then, so basically, when we do an RWE submission, it's supposed to follow a standard developed for clinical trials. So this creates some challenges because some of the real world data elements, they cannot be really mapped into the CDISC standards. And some of the required elements in the CDISC actually is not available in the real world data. So a question, for everybody, for panelists also, especially for our FDA friends is this the time we think about, is one size fits all? Should we have one size fits all standard for, clinical trials, real world data, or should we have maybe different standards for real world data submissions?
So maybe I'll start, and then Tala can chime in as well. And I think you raise a really important question, and I would say it's something that we're discussing a lot. I think it's a really important topic, and certainly understand the questions around CDISC. I would say that there is across the board a lot of evolution around data standards, interoperability, harmonization, especially as it comes to RWE. I mean, you're seeing a lot of movement in this area, even thinking about CDISC as it applies to EHR implementation, I think as well. There's a lot of work, specifically in oncology through Cancer Moonshot. There's a lot of work in this area of using M-code, USCDI+. So I do think that you will continue to see this this kind of evolution of how we think about the differences between EHR or real world data, other types of data other than clinical trial data. And it is I would say across the board, across our centers, an area of active research and discussion. And you want to add?
Yeah, the one thing that I'll add to that, and I think this is consistent with any emerging technology, not just RWD to RWE, DHTs, or AI. You know, we put out guidance based on our experience and based on where the field is, and we solicit that feedback. Not to brag, because I'm with the FDA, but we've done a really good job with the RWE program. And now we're starting to see other regulators come up with their own policies around the use of RWD to RWE. This is normal. That's what usually happens. And then the next step would be for all of us to try to figure out areas where we can harmonize. There will always be local jurisdiction differences, especially when it comes to things like data privacy, right? That might prevent us from doing certain things the same way across the globe. But that is a part of the normal evolution. This is why having these discussions is so critical, and getting feedback on the guidances is also very critical.
Indeed. Nicole, go right ahead.
Would it be disruptive to go back to the data quality question?
No, not at all. Go right ahead. I don't think you've had a chance to chime in. So I think, you know, naturally we're leading into another question that I have for the panel. But before we do that, go right ahead.
Yeah, so what I was going to say about that, and not to say this, the data standards discussion is also of great interest. But what I was going to say about data reliability and relevance is that if you look just on its face, FDA's definition of data reliability is very detailed, and relevance very detailed. It talks about variables that are important for fitness for use. Whereas some other regulators have very high level descriptions. And in fact, if you look at EMA's recent real world data draft framework, you'll see that reliability is a dimension of data quality. So they're looking at it in a different way. It almost looks like the definition of accuracy. Accuracy is a sub-definition. So without going into all of the details about it, it just goes to show that there are different conceptual frameworks for thinking about data quality. And the important thing, at least from my perspective as a policy person, is to see, are those differences meaningful or not? Are the concepts the same? I have hope that the concepts are the same when I look at ICH M14, because there was alignment on definitions. A lot of them happen to be the FDA, but at least there was some sense of an agreement that they could publish a draft guidance that has settled upon definitions. I think if you look in the stakeholder community, there are an awful lot of tools that are available to help implement data quality assessments and reporting. And there too, if you take a look, and I have done that in collaboration with some partners across industry, if you take a look there, you'll also find that the tools that are available that could help teams do their assessments and do their reporting, they use different terminology as well. So again, it's a mapping exercise to see if all of the concepts are covered. So when you actually go to try to evaluate data for a specific use case, you can use the tools that are available and meet the expectations of one regulator or another, or hopefully global regulators. So I just wanted to point that out in terms of thinking about data reliability, accuracy, traceability, all of the topics that we know and love.
Wonderful. Yeah, go right ahead.
I was going to say, so I think that this is such an important point, and I'd say we spend a fair amount of time thinking about words, the definitions of words, and it's really a really big, kudos to the teams that work on all of these guidances. We spend a lot of time really thinking carefully about what makes sense. And I think fundamentally what you're saying, the question of, if somebody says this is reliability, somebody says this is accuracy, ultimately it's about the core scientific principles. So we would hope that forward thinking across the globe, that there is this kind of thought in mind that ultimately people are using good pharmacoepidemiologic practices, that they're staying, aligned with the methods and, appropriate study conduct. But it's certainly a good point, and to both of your comments, I think a great opportunity for us to hear your feedback as well, to see what we can do to advance the work together.
Definitely. I have another question with respect to AI. So, as we think about real world data and these terms that we agree are very important to define fit for use real world data, how might AI change the way real world data is used to generate fit for purpose real world evidence? Is this something that you guys think about, or something that that we can perhaps envision for the present and the future? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions there.
To clarify, AI used to create the data, is that what you're asking? AI to create fit for
AI
use data?
It could be create. It could be the, how we might even change
For
our
evidence generation.
operations
Got it.
around real world data processing, anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us probably were doing machine learning before we knew it was fancy AI, right? But now
Or real
it's
world
just,
data
or
before we
real
knew
world
it
data
was real
before
world
we knew
data.
it was real world data. And this is kind of along the same lines of what John said. A lot of these concepts are not really all that new, but with AI, a lot of new AI technologies are really very different from what we're used to, and they're very powerful. So yes, I'm biased because
That's
I
your
work
thing,
in AI,
yeah.
but I do think that AI technologies can be very transformative for potentially, filling in some of the gaps that we have with RWD when we talk about completeness of data. I think a lot of us learned in EPI that multiple imputations of missing data is better than using missing data, right? So that is one thing that AI can help with, but also analysis to basically generate that evidence. Absolutely.
For sure. Any other thoughts?
I think it's exciting times. I got my first NIH grant in artificial intelligence almost 20 years ago, and we could do almost nothing. Everyone is excited if we did a little natural language processing. And I look at where we're at today. The last study I worked on, we had 100,000 patients and tens of millions of encounters. And from each encounter, we were getting hundreds of features out. And there's no way that anyone could abstract that.
Yeah.
There's just no way. And most of these conditions, they're happening at scale. Some rare diseases and some forms of oncology we can do with 50 or 100 patients, but most of the healthcare is happening at scale. And you can't do that without AI. And so as we look at it and we measure our accuracy and we trace, we do all the things that we should to see whether our AI is behaving well or badly, if it's hallucinating or if it's giving us true answers. I think there's a really bright future here. To take it the next step, how do you analyze? It's fun. I can ask our system today, please create a cohort with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction with patients with ejection fraction under 25%. And I can't say it does it real time, but within 10 minutes, we have the cohort created with thousands of patients, and we can see the table 1. There's just so much that can be done today that couldn't be done even 2 years ago.
And on top of all of that, with this amount of data, you also have the multimodal data, right? That's been very difficult to kind of integrate into one analysis plane that now you could do with AI. So the richness of information, and especially for things like rare diseases, where you have a lot of data on few people, deep data. That's where I think AI can also be very powerful.
Yeah, and I think it will really contribute, hopefully towards what we all envision as kind of a learning healthcare system, right? How can it underlay some of the fundamental tools that where it's hard to elucidate maybe response data from the electronic health record, or it's hard to find patients that have a specific type of rare disease. And so is there a way that we can AI as a tool to really empower learning healthcare?
Yeah, I just want to add one quick comment is in the healthcare system is about 80% of the data, they are unstructured data. So for those unstructured data, the AI techniques can really, like especially the natural language processing techniques, can really enable the abstraction of those data and make it usable for the decision-making process.
It's incredibly powerful. I was asked today about a disease, and I was asked, can we go back to DICOM images? We often will just look at radiology reports. Can we go back to DICOM images? Can we look at the scans and understand what the precursor scans look like and tie that to outcomes and understand maybe there's a better way to predict who's going to do well and who's going to do badly, better way to figure out who gets what treatment and who gets another. And I think that's the promise of the learning health system is we learn from daily care, and then we have a cycle where we also learn from all the data pouring in and say, okay, maybe there's a better way.
For sure. All right. Well, I have one more question before I turn to questions from the audience. So, Tala, you talked a bit about the need for an interdisciplinary approach, to addressing the challenges we've talked about today and opportunities. Taking those opportunities to do something better. We often see medical product developers or drugs development sponsors partnering with data curators, academia, patient advocacy organizations, that may or may not have their own registries, to advance real-world data sourcing and curation goals. So in your experience or in your thoughts, as we endeavor to continue, doing that as a community, what works well as far as these collaborative approaches to achieving reliable and relevant real-world data? And what are some challenges that you might have come across even in your collaborative approaches that you have taken?
I can take the first step and then welcome other panelists' opinions. I think these collaborative approaches can be highly effective, but there are also some challenges. I can share some of my thoughts in terms of the strengths and the challenges of these collaborations. So I think in terms of the strengths, first and foremost, I think is the diverse expertise and the perspectives. So the collaboration brings together very diverse expertise and perspective, enhancing the reliability and the relevance of the real-world data. And for example, the academia can provide a methodological rigor and the innovative research approaches, and the patient groups can help ensure the data collected is very relevant to the patient community and therefore increasing its applicability to real-world clinical settings. And another strength is the shared resources and the infrastructure. In this way, it can reduce the cost and improve efficiency. And in addition, the access to a broader range of data sources and analytical tools can improve the robustness of real-world data. I think the next strength would be improve the data quality and integrity, and then also enhance the trust and engagement. Engaging patient advocacy groups can build trust and encourage patient participation. So this can lead to a more comprehensive data sets, and also the transparent communication and shared goals can foster stronger partnerships and sustained collaboration. In terms of challenges, I think the biggest challenge is the alignment on the goals and the priorities. Everybody wants something different. So when we have very different stakeholders working together, they probably have different goals and perspectives, and then lead to conflict or misalignment on the project objectives. So we need to carefully balance the commercial interest with the scientific goals and the patient-centered goals. Another challenge, I think it has been mentioned previously, I think is the data privacy and the security, and especially the collaboration would be more challenging and complicated when we navigate through different data protection regulations across different countries and regions. And another challenge is the the data standardization and data interoperability. So the different data sources often lack of standardization. I think other panelists mentioned that this makes the data integration and analysis very difficult. So I think it's just, in summary, I think there's lots of benefits, but there are also challenges. So we need to, work together to generate reliable and relevant data. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, of course. Go right ahead.
So I think that's, already a very true and sound list of challenges and also potential opportunities. I really find it interesting and apparent that there are different goals and incentives. So for example, electronic health records are not there to support research or drug development. And so maybe we have to think about, and I know people have, we've said this at Duke-Margolis many years in a row, maybe think about, incentives for data collection at the points of care that might make it more useful in the long run. So there are things like that that we need to think about. I also think about the power of kind of regulatory guidance and setting expectations, especially for, let's say, patient registries, because they are, and disease registries, they're eager to, in many cases, help support the development of new treatments and new medicines. But my experience has been working in regulatory workshops and the like. They really are starting at a very different place in terms of understanding what the regulatory expectations are. So what I would like to see in a future state is that we get more clarity, we work together as a community on guidance and best practices, and then over time, there'll be a better understanding of what quality by design would look like in terms of when you're conducting a registry and you're collecting data, it'll be high enough quality for the uses that we want it to be beneficial for.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that point up, because I do think one thing, we're talking about how real data can be successful, right, in this context. And I think one of those things is, we say it a lot, is early and often communication, right, with the FDA, because I do think that obviously our goal is supporting drug development broadly, and whether that's from the sponsor side, or as you mentioned, from other potentially patient advocacy groups. I think we're always open to meeting with groups and trying to figure out ways in which we can be a collaborative force to further drug development overall. So I think one aspect of where I've seen it successful is this early and often communication.
Yeah, definitely. And, I'm glad you brought up the point about, patient generated data. In fact, we have a question on that topic from an audience member. You've already talked about, what can be done to ensure that, patient generated data, patient registry data being, one type of this, what can be done? How can we operationalize, key fit for purpose terms to ensure that their data is being used in ways that meet regulatory and or research goals that are important to support product development for those buy-in for those patients, where they are willing to contribute their data to such causes. Earlier this year, the Duke-Margolis Institute even published a white paper talking a bit more about this, but I'd love to bring that conversation to you all now. So someone from the audience has asked, what validation methods or anything like that can be used to ensure that patient-generated health data can be relevant and reliable and acceptable in near or long term to regulators in order to support patient goals for drug development.
To an extent, patient-generated data is already used even in RCTs, right? You have patient diaries or DHTs, I think it comes down to the same issue that we've talked about, is that the data has to be fit for use. So as an ecosystem, we have to find ways to be able to support the collection of such data that it is fit for use and can meet the regulatory standards. But we are seeing a lot of patient-generated data used out there in general. This is also a big thing for AI. It's a huge thing for DHTs. So mapping it to how the data can be fit for use, in my opinion, would be very important.
For sure. Actually, Tala, there's a question that came in likely for you. I'm thinking more about what do we mean when we say fit for use within context where AI and RWE are applied. So as industry applies guidances on the use of real-world evidence, real-world data sources and algorithms that can be used to define exposures or outcomes, all of this being evaluated again for to determine, fit for purposeness. Do you see a future for the development of, some sort of data use tool like a registry or, something for reusability to evaluate algorithms or even, I would say, quality control them even sometimes? What are, is this something that you think about?
I think the person might be asking about this concept of assurance labs that's been discussed out there. There are many different concepts related to assurance labs. I believe what the question is, do we envision a situation where there would be a lot of data available for folks to be able to evaluate the performance of an algorithm that they develop, right?
Okay.
Ideally, there would be an environment where this can happen. There are a lot of efforts right now through different partnerships to enable different data to come together, whether it's through a federated learning data system or some other type of architecture that can secure patient privacy, but also intellectual property, where you can develop your algorithm and then test it on data from another data holder or a data owner. I think generally that's a good idea, right? Because for AI, like I said, when you create an algorithm, that algorithm has been trained on some form of data. And we would hope that that training data is also fit for use. It's kind of like a meta concept, right? And then you're applying the algorithm, if you're applying it on RWD to generate evidence, we always want to look at whether that algorithm can extrapolate to different situations, right? If it's generalizable. That's one way to assess the validity of these algorithms. So testing it on other data would be a great way to do that.
Would be ideal.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. I have another question from the audience that I think would be good for this group to discuss. So although accuracy, completeness, and traceability of data are important, for RWE generation, or at least high quality or RWE generation, what are your thoughts on generalizability? We've even, talked about ways in which different types of data, can be leveraged to ensure generalizability, even AI being used to enhance data generalizability. Someone says that, it's just as important, although very difficult to achieve as a more complete data set. So what are your thoughts on the term generalizability and what that means here?
I can chime in again here.
Sure.
Again, going back to my EPI training, the EPI concepts like internal validity, external validity. The first thing we need to do is be internally valid, right? So your analysis has to be internally valid before we start looking at external validity. External validity and generalizability is one of the strengths of using RWE, because now you don't have an RCT with very strict enrollment or inclusion criteria. So yes, it can be a very powerful tool, but we can't forget that you have to do the analysis correctly and you have to have that internal validity of your analysis. But that is one of the strengths of using RWE, right? That you have more representation across various groups rather than in a very restricted environment, like in an RCT.
Yes.
I just want to add one quick comment. I think the generability has a close tie with the relevance.
Yes.
Data relevance. So if we have relevant data, I think we can at least generalize that to a certain degree. And and then the generability, it could be at different level, right?
Yep.
So when we conduct clinical trials, the generability it should be applicable to the study population. Yep. And then sometimes FDA is able to give you a label, maybe expand that a little bit, generalize that a little bit more, but I think it depending on this case by case specific situation, how much it can be general, how much the generability could be is really depending on the situation. Yeah, how relevant the data are.
Yeah, I might bring those points together and say, I think a lot of times when we think about, I would completely agree, you need internal validity and that's paramount. But as you think about, really, what is the clinical setting this is being used for? What is the question that's being answered? And then, are the data fit for use? All of these kind of sequential questions that you have to ask to then say, is this generalizable to the intended use population? And I think from a regulatory perspective, one of the questions we're always asking is how is this applicable to the intended use population in the United States? Because our regulations require applicability to US clinical practice. So it's kind of tying all of these threads together and then really evaluating how is this generalizable to the question being asked and to the population that the drug is intended to serve.
For sure. Awesome. Well, we actually want to take questions from our in-person audience here today. I see hands being raised. We do have someone with us who can bring you a microphone. I think the podium's blocking me from seeing everyone, but I see at least one hand going up, and I definitely encourage others to do the same. Please go right ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for a great panel. My name is Sari Rampur. I represent industry. I represent regular citizens with a great concern about how we do with our healthcare and how we do with the drug. I love the statement that Tala mentioned at the beginning that let's bring the scientists, the data scientists, computer scientists. I am one of those who might not understand or speak the same language. I hope that we can be part of the conversation. And another concern that I have is the patient voice. When we talk about the quality of the data, what is the good data? Or we talk about efficacy of the drug. Back in 2019, I was in a cancer conference and they were comparing 3 different drugs for cancer patients. And there they were talking about how longer patient will live under each of these drugs, not considering the quality of the life. 15 years later, we see similar, efficacy measure. And I think that's part of the things that I hope that FDA would step up and define those efficacy, which is more aligned with the patient voice. That is one of the, observation that we have, and I hope it's helpful if I share it here. And there is a phenomenon is going on. It started a while back. Back in 2018, there was a survey that shows the public trust on pharma dropped to be exact, 38%. And that was before COVID and before all of these things that we're hearing right now. And part of it is because I feel the patient is not part of it. Now we talk about the good data. In 2018, National Cancer Institute issued series of standards how to collect patient-reported outcome, patient quality of life data. They call it Pro-CTCAE. We did develop the platform to collect the data based on those standards in real time. And when you're collecting the real-time data, as per the standard, you can easily phenotyping the patient, which is very helpful for AI. I think Dan wouldn't, appreciate that, because then you collect the climate data, you're collecting the geography of where the data it is, and you can measure the efficacy of these drug in much granular way. We presented our approach to 2 oncology division, although the CEO of the hospital were pro and loved it, but the oncology division pushed back. Why? They said, the way you enable the patient to report these symptoms, these outcomes, and their quality of life as they go through their cancer treatment is so wide, and we were using NCI standard. It is in a way that brings liability for us. So they pushed back, and they had all the right to do it, you know. But I think it's FDA, it needs to step up and, you know, enforce this type of real world evidence data collection that supports patient more than anyone else, that brings patient voice. So I would love to get your feedback about this.
Thank you.
I-
Of course,
yes,
go right ahead.
Well, first I want to say thank you for your comment, and I think you're absolutely right. I think the patient voice is of paramount importance. You know, the Oncology Center of Excellence has Project Patient Voice, which is actually a way that we're integrating patient-reported feedback on medical products. And so I think in the context of that project, as well as a lot of our patient-focused drug development projects, it is and certainly something that is valued and understood. And of course, our regulations require that medications are safe and effective. So in the context of safety and efficacy, as well as patient tolerability and patient perspectives, is something that's being integrated. And I'd encourage, you know, further, if you have additional questions or conversation, further communication on that. Thanks.
Awesome. We have time for just one more question before we move to our next break.
Thanks, guys. Great panel. My name is Van Crocker. I think I might be among the only people with a payer background in the group here. So obviously I'm going to harp on that for a minute. I'll try to be brief though. Tala, you said 2 things that really stuck with me about developing reliable AI-based models. One is train on fit for purpose. Let's call it gold standard data. And the second is, once you do that, employ an externally useful language, let us say, so that you can both internally rely upon the model, but also generalize that model out beyond the system or the environment where it was originally developed. My hypothesis is that claims data, or more accurately, the standards employed in claims data, machine readability, and a level of decent detail, but not total detail, is ideal for that external generalizability. Probably the only broadly applicable one available in the United States, and that you can do incredible internal validation with lots of other approaches. But if you want everyone to speak the language, you have to use a lingua franca. This question's for everybody, but I'm going to pick on you, Tala, because you gave everyone such a good framework.
It depends on what you're developing the algorithm for, right? And if using claims data to validate the outcome from your model makes sense, sure, that could be one way to do that type of validation. Again, it depends on exactly how you're using AI in the context of RWD.
All right. Well, we are at time. Thank you to each of you for being here with us today. Fantastic discussion. I found this to be very thought-provoking, and I hope everyone else did as well in our audience, both in person and online. So we are going to break for 15 minutes. Next up will be session 2, focused on methodological considerations for RWE. So we hope to see you all back for our next session in 15 minutes.
Welcome back to session 2. For those that don't know me, my name is Trevin Locke. I'm Assistant Research Director here at the Duke Margolis Institute for Health Policy. Very excited to be moderating a great panel for our second session on methodological considerations for real-world evidence. As Garrett said at the top of the meeting, we'll be discussing considerations for generating real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making, including decision challenges and potential solutions to those challenges. Like Rachel before me, I'm going to start us off by introducing the panel. They'll all share a few short remarks to get started, and then we'll dive into Q&A and try to get some interaction from the audience as well. So keep leveraging that Slido to send your questions in. So I'm pleased to be joined today by Jenny Lee, Associate Director for Real World Evidence at the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology in CEDAR at FDA. Yoon Liu, Deputy Division Director of the Division of Analytics and Benefit Risk Assessment within the CBER Office of Biostatistics and Pharmacovigilance at FDA. Simon Desjardins, the lead for methods and innovation in the Real World Evidence platform at Pfizer. On the screen, Stephen James, Professor of Cardiology and Scientific Director of the Uppsala Clinical Research Center at Uppsala University. And to my far right, Sebastian Schneeweiss, Professor of Medicine at the Harvard Medical School and the Chief of the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. So now we'll turn to the speakers to get us started. Jenny, we'll start with you.
Good afternoon. Glad to be here. I hope to spend a few minutes talk about methodological development by the FDA Sentinel system. Then I will make a few comments on the external control trials. First, real-world data sources have grown substantially in the past 2 decades. To leverage the full potential of the emerging data source and to generate quality real-world evidence, we need new methods. Sentinel FDA is exploring new tools and methods to extract research quality information from EHR data. For example, one study identified safety outcome acute pancreatitis using a phenotyping algorithm with the structured data, lab results, and unstructured data. Another study first identified individuals from structured data with the potential use of cannabis-derived product. Then in the unstructured data, in clinical notes, the NLP-assisted algorithm are used to identify such exposure. Secondly, for non-interventional study with the claims data, it tends to be challenged to measure and control confounding to full extent. Sentinel is linking EHR claims, try to assess whether there are unmeasured confounder in the safety study. Such assessment could inform study design decision-making. One study identified unmeasured confounders in linked EHR data and then assess the baseline balance between the treatment arms. Another study, I think, went further and run simulations to try to describe potential bias distribution in the linked EHR data among subset of the patient population. And third challenge is how to deal with the missing data. I think Sentinel built a framework and also tools to really assess what's the pattern and the mechanism of missingness. They evaluate 3 different methods to handle missing data in the linked each EHR among subpopulation who has available information on those unmeasured confounders. Last one, it's Sentinel published a framework on causal inference. It's a stepwise process that systematically consider a key design analysis choices. The goal is to enhance the interpretability of the study results. In a few minutes, I don't even scratch the surface of the depth of those projects. So the website is the best resource to go to. Now moving to talk about on the side of effectiveness studies. We have seen many external control trials, mostly historical controls from real world data sources. I think to consider using external controls, especially historical controls, perhaps the investigators should ask those questions first. One, whether the diagnosis and treatment change over years. Two, what's a good real world endpoint going to be? How to measure such endpoints, taking into account the timing and the frequency of clinical assessment in the real world. A third question, what's a good comparator? Especially when the standard of care may or may not be well established or measurable. Four, whether the disease course and the mechanism of the disease and the prognostic factors are relatively known so that you can design the study around those information. Lastly, how likely the two arms will be comparable on key baseline factors such as disease severity. So all those questions, a detailed study protocol could proactively address those concerns, and good knowledge on the disease of the interest, on the landscape of the treatment are helpful for you to design such study and to really select comparable controls, external controls. Last point, even for a secondary analysis of existing data, a protocol could really explain, justify the use of such design, why you choose the design parameters, and what's the inclusion, exclusion criteria, and who were included in the secondary analysis. So those are what we're looking for.
Thanks so much, Jenny. That was a terrific overview of a lot of important considerations. Yoon, we'll go to you next.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I speak, I need to make an important disclaimer. My comments are informal communication and represent my own biased judgment. These comments do not bind or obligate FDA. I work for FDA CBER. CBER regulates blood, vaccines, antigenics, tissue, cell, and gene therapies. I think most people are familiar with COVID vaccines. So I'm going to use vaccines example to illustrate RWE work that we are doing at CBER. We not only review RWE submissions, we also generate RWE because vaccines are administered to healthy individuals. So we need to make sure that we monitor the safety and the effectiveness of vaccines. So for vaccine studies, we typically start from asking a question. Then we understand the data, look at what are source of biases in the data. We try to minimize bias in the design stage, conduct appropriate analysis, and also perform sensitivity analysis to test the robustness of the result. We also use additional analysis to detect residual confounding and quantify the bias. And I want to emphasize on the iterative nature of this approach because those sensitivity analysis and additional analysis actually can inform our future study design analysis and can also motivate methodology development. So for COVID vaccines, probably you can remember during early rollout of the pandemic, there are long lines at mass vaccination site and no insurance information was collected. So there were under capture of vaccination status. To handle this potential source of biases, actually many approaches are acceptable. There's really no one-size-fits-all solution. So the work we are doing at CBER, we connect our data, partner data, with immunization information system, IIS. By linking two data sources, it can significantly improve the capture of vaccination status. And in submissions, for safety studies, sometimes sponsor propose self-controlled method only include people who have vaccination record. Those are also acceptable because this underreporting of vaccination status won't bias the result, can only decrease sample size. And there are also statistical methods proposed to help address the underreporting vaccination status. You can see that there are many opportunities. Another issue associated with non-interventional study is unmeasured confounding. Because when we look at vaccinated versus unvaccinated individuals, actually, vaccinated people, they tend to seek healthcare more. So there is differential health-seeking behavior that could also bias result. So for studies, some of them propose different study design. For example, test negative case control study, which controls for health-seeking behavior difference, and also the self-controlled method, because we use a person as his or her own control. So this between person health-seeking behavior difference have been controlled implicitly by design. And also there are studies, for example, using the comparison group who have received other types of vaccines that could also address some of the health-seeking behavior differences. At the same time, there are also statistical methodology developed to address this issue. For example, there is double negative control method that is a part of PDUFA 7 commitment. And the CBER is working on developing method to apply this to vaccine effectiveness studies to address bias due to unmeasured confounding. And another issue related to RWE submission is patient-level data access, especially for vaccines, when some vaccines actually have been given to millions of individuals. And we have heard challenges from interested parties expressing challenges regarding the patient-level data access. I think that the field, we can work together and will welcome methodology development to address this issue. So RWE is an evolving field. I think we can work together and communicate the lessons learned from all those past studies and help move this forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yoon. Great overview again. Simon, we'll move down the line to you next.
Thanks for the invitation. I work in RWE innovation at Pfizer, and views I'm going to share today are my own. I was asked to think about areas where there could be innovation in methods related to RWE. And I think it's well established by now that RWE can be used in situations where traditional RCT isn't feasible. Rare diseases, placebo is not ethical. Study can't keep up with a changing standard of care. So I think rare disease and oncology will continue to make great strides. But I think if we want to innovate, we have to look at another area. And polar opposite would be very common diseases like type 2 diabetes or obesity. When you're developing a drug for type 2 diabetes, the expectation is still that you do a very large cardiovascular outcome trial. And for those who don't know, these are studies that tend to have 8, 10, 12,000 patients in them. They take 5, 6, 7 years to do. They cost $1 billion, $1.5 billion. And you do them waiting for an event to occur. And once you have a difference, you can end your trial. And the events you're looking for are things like myocardial infarction, cardiovascular hospitalization, revascularization procedures, or death. And if you think about those endpoints, they're fairly well captured in real world data. In fact, there was a demonstration project funded by FDA and the NIH that was done by your group, Sebastian. And one of the publications from RCT Duplicate focused on CVOTs. And it was a bit of a thought experiment. What if a drug had been approved and placed on the market, and you were to decide solely based on real world evidence whether that drug had a CVOT benefit? And the simple answer is that CVOTs could be emulated fairly well using RWE. So does that mean that FDA will forego CVOTs and move entirely to RWE? I don't think so. I don't think that's going to happen. But this is where the hybrid design comes in. How do we move from where we are now, 10,000 patients, 5+ years, $1 billion, to purely based on RWE after approval? Maybe this is where we have to combine elements of both. So maybe instead of having a 10,000 person study, maybe you can think about having the same number of drug treated, but maybe your control group can be made up of prospective controls augmented by external controls. And then instead of 10,000, maybe you need 7,500. And if you want controls, you can get those from real world data. Another example of a hybrid approach would be, these are studies where there's a very long follow-up, and maybe some of the follow-up could be done with traditional follow-up visits with a centralized site, but maybe some of the follow-up could be done passively using real world data to allow for that 5, 6, 7-year follow-up. So I think this is an area where there's enough groundwork that's been laid that maybe the next step is RCT Duplicate 2.0, where, I don't know, maybe you look at EHR data to see if the addition of claims in EHR gives you an even better ability to emulate. Or maybe FDA starts to consider demonstration projects with hybrid designs for CVOTs. So I think that's an area that's ripe for innovation.
Thanks so much, Simon. Another great overview. Next, can we go to the screen? Stefan, I hope you're hearing us and are ready. We'll turn to you next.
I hear you well. And in order to address this, I'd like to follow up on the hybrid solutions that we just heard and give you a very brief background on where we are in our country and where we've gone with real world data and evidence. And so we have developed for many years dedicated what we call quality registries. Features with these is that they are ability to describe and enhance the quality of care of patients, not research necessarily in the first place. They are funded by the healthcare providers and the government. The organization is very much bottom up, so they're really led from professionals and clinicians. And it was a data set, common data sets. The most important features is that these are entered non-select, complete populations. That's basically. We have about 110 of those dedicated registries. They have been used now for many years to derive to do observational studies of high quality, usually because they're very valid, well-described variables. They have outcomes that are complete, thanks also to national mandatory registries. For many years, we've realized that we also want to randomize more frequently because randomization is key in order to be able to draw conclusive evidence and causality. And so 15 years ago, we started to do randomized trials within these registries. So simply use the registries as they are, but add a randomization module that is linked to the registry. That's not necessarily be built upon the same platform, but it's available from the same web page. And so that we try to let the clinicians, again, and the researchers come up with research ideas that can be addressed. and make them randomize non-selectively, preferably all patients in the field if possible. It depends, of course, on the research question. Now we have been using that system for probably 25 or so large trials that were addressing clinical issues, prospective randomization, but enrolling complete populations. Some of them have used ICD codes or other available data sources for outcomes, but some of them are too specific and cannot use ICD codes. So then we have built different types of hybrid solutions. So it could be detecting outcomes from a radiological investigation, or sometimes to adjudicate more complex outcomes. That has led to an evidence generation that has sped up the process of doing more randomized trials. All of these trials have been published in the most prestigious journals, so there seems to be a lot of trust in the system. We have realized, though, for the last few years that Sweden is just too small to do large trials for more rare diseases. We can do it for very common diseases, but now we expanded the system, so we're building what we call EuroHeart, and that is an initiative across the European Society of Cardiology, 55 member states. We have 5 disease domains: ACS, PCI, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, and valvular heart disease. We have 14 countries now that have joined, comprising most of Europe, including Scandinavia, United Kingdom, France, Spain, Italy, Switzerland, Hungary, etc. And the idea here with this network is that we have come together, defined common data sets, variables for baseline characteristics and outcomes. We have we're offering a technical platform if the countries want to have that. Otherwise, we use whatever is available. National registries. We allow them to be slightly different in terms of legal control, in terms of variables, but we want them to keep the mandated common data set. And we don't ship the data between countries, because in the 55 member states of the European Society of Cardiology, there are multiple languages and legal entities to consider. And so we perform federated analyses so the data can be kept in each country. We send them a code in our statistics. They run their code and ship the results back to a central data warehouse. So that is the development that we're doing, and we have just recently started to plan the first randomized trial with this network. And the goal here is to be able to randomize in this first trial, 8,000 patients in a couple of months. We think that's feasible. We've also tried to automate randomization evidence and randomized evidence by not only inviting patients to randomized experiments at hospital visits. And now it's possible to reach out to patients and people in the population by national email systems. So the next heart failure trial we're planning at the moment is trying to identify the patients in the registry, but then reach out to patients' home by email lists. And there's not a single visit to a clinician in the trial. Medication will be shipped home to patients. They will be randomized virtually. There's a virtual consent form, and outcomes will be captured through automatic ICD codes. So I see, I'll just give a number of examples, but I see incredible opportunities doing real-world data and real-world evidence for various types of research question hypotheses. So, and they have to be adapted to why the question was asked. Is this something that was addressed to inform guideline writers, or is it a regulatory issue? If there are regulatory purposes, we've done several of those also, but we just need to make sure that the data quality is high enough and the outcomes are well defined enough in order to meet the high standards of a regulatory trial. And I think we have learned more and more that that's possible, and in many instances, both with medical devices and pharmacological therapies and like strategy questions. So that's the background summary from my side. I see, of course, challenges. Everything has to be thought through very thoroughly, but I see enormous possibilities and opportunities.
Thanks so much, Stefan, and thanks for spending a little bit of your night with us over here on the East Coast of the States. Sebastian, we'll have you round out this opening portion.
Yeah, of course, pleasure to be here. And I guess I'm building a little bit on Simon's use case. The use case being, or the regulatory use case being, expanding your effectiveness claim in your labeled language, right? I think there is enormous opportunity working with real-world data by what we call the bench XCal approach. You start out with benchmarking. You benchmark once a product is in the marketplace, you benchmark with your real-world data against the phase 3 trials and try to emulate these phase 3 trials in design and the measurements. Right? This is a very exciting and humbling experience at the same time. We have done this multiple times now with RC duplicate and other activities, you will learn a lot about the underlying data. You will learn a lot about what you like to achieve and what you cannot achieve. If you're lucky enough that your measurements are of such quality that you can actually really emulate the trial and you get the same finding, right? That's a huge booster in trust in your data analytics setup, right? And from that, you expand. Right now, you haven't learned anything really. You just replicated a trial, right? You probably, when in doubt, you probably would trust the trial more, right? Don't quote me on that. But now you expand. That's much more interesting, right? You expand into population that were excluded, women of childbearing age, older adults. You look at other endpoints rather than biomarkers. Now you look at clinical endpoints. So you leave that up to your imagination, what you expand, but you expand one characteristic at a time. And you hope that you can uphold the validity of your data analytics setup, which may or may not shift a little bit with regard to the assumptions when you go to different endpoints and different populations. The confounding situation might shift and things like that. But overall, you have this enormous confidence now in your data and analytics setup. And I think that approach is still underutilized. We're still learning a lot. We are working actually with our friends and colleagues from FDA in a demonstration project and demonstrating that and playing that through. One is in cardiovascular outcome trials, which I think in particular cardiovascular space is ripe for that type of approach. Do we really, if you think about some of the very successful molecules in cardiovascular where over 15 years, there were maybe 10, 15 randomized trials done to incrementally expand the indication. Do we really need to do this? Do we need to do randomized trials every time again? Do our patients really need to wait 15 years until the last randomized trial is done? Can we expedite this? And I'm not so much concerned about how much the trials cost. That's not really my thing. I'm worried about patients getting access to knowledge and evidence that can be derived in this benchmarking and expansion approach that I just outlined. And the calibration approach is statistical tool that I don't need to go in here. I think you understand what I mean by using real-world evidence to expand effectiveness claims. If you bear with me, I want to make a second point, particularly also with regard to the last panel. And I will mark this meeting in my calendar as a success if I get you thinking about this, is about data quality. And my plea is that whenever we talk about data quality, we all use different terms. Let's just start with the measurement characteristics. Starting with that's what we really want to know. And if we want to come to causal conclusions in our real-world evidence study, we need to know the measurement characteristics. So if you have a binary clinical endpoint, you want to know the sensitivity, specificity, maybe PPV. But these are measurement characteristics. What you learn immediately is there is no perfect measurement, right? There is, for all practical reasons, there's basically no measurement at 100% sensitivity and 100% specificity. Something's got to give, usually, right? And as then Riskin already said, many people will be very surprised about the measurement characteristics in their data source and not necessarily pleasantly surprised. And then looking forward, once you understand there is no perfect data source, no single perfect data source, but you understand how imperfect, to what degree your measurement is not quite perfect, what is the impact on bias? And this is called quantitative bias analysis. You can only do a quantitative bias analysis once you know where you are. We need to know the measurement characteristics. There's looking forward and making the assessment. Given that my measurement is not perfect, but it's good enough, and we can have a conversation about good enough, then we can extrapolate and say, look, had I had perfect measurement, then I would be here and here, right? And looking backwards, of course, it means, well, what are the data sources that get me to this specificity measurement, to this PPV that I want to have, right? And rather than starting a conversation, I wish you would do a, let's say, a registry study, because implicitly somebody has thought, well, in a registry study, I probably can reach these measurement characteristics. Just have a conversation, but I would love to see the outcome measured with a specificity of, I don't know, let's say 90% or something like that, right? Because then you work backwards, say, how can I get to that? Do I need to collect new information? Can I work with claims data? Can I work with EHR data, right? It becomes a much more informed and targeted conversation rather than having somebody dictate to you, and sometimes we see this in PMR language, you shall use a registry, but it's not the point. You shall reach a certain measurement characteristic. That's a much more healthy conversation. And then we have a secondary conversation. How do we get there? And I pause here.
Thanks so much, Sebastian, and to everyone else. We've already covered, I think, a ton of ground in a short amount of time. So we got a couple questions to start with, but we'll again encourage folks online to be using the Slido to send some questions, and then those in the room to get yours ready. I'll be coming to you soon. But first, I want to start with a couple questions that I had. I think across all of you, we heard about a lot of considerations, instructive examples, of how to think about issues in this space. What can we be doing to promote kind of understanding of best practices for real-world evidence use among parties that are thinking about bringing, a study or a program to, the FDA or other regulatory agencies? Kind of how do we translate these examples that you've all kind of so wonderfully highlighted into best practices that kind of help us all move the field forward? Any thoughts there?
I'm happy to go first. My thinking these days is that we have learned a lot about study design, about the analysis of secondary data in order to reach causal conclusions over the last 2-3 decades, particularly in the safety space, which we transport over in the effectiveness space. We've learned a lot. The people who execute these studies are getting more sophisticated, and the reviewers on the other side are getting way more sophisticated, right? So this is all very positive. What I sometimes observe is when and this is on the HTA side as well as the regulatory side internationally, that when people don't want to engage in conversations or very limited engagement on real-world evidence, it's largely because they are uncertain about the underlying data source, because that remains to be a black box where people are sophisticated in reading, I don't know what a propensity score is and these things, right? People understand that very well. I'm not underestimating them, but people then have this block saying, look, in a randomized trial where we usually work 99% of the time, we work with primary data, I assume that the measurement quality is, near to perfect, right? But in data from clinical practice, I would need to know the measurement characteristics in order to make that jump to even engage in this conversation about real-world evidence, because I need to understand the data quality, but the data fit for purpose. And often this information is missing. And I think FDA is quite good at requesting that, particularly in the outcome measurement with regard to, what is show me a validation study, and then the guidance documents are also quite clear about that. We need to invest more time and money. And on an academic side, you don't get promoted for doing validation studies. You don't get grant money unless, and maybe Simon wants to sponsor more. So it's a dead end. You see way too few of these validation exercises give us the information that we need. And I'm really looking more and more at the data vendors and data providers that they should provide quality metrics, like measurement characteristics. What is the PPV to identify a stroke, an MI, what have you, liver failure, right? So,
yeah, if I may add, I agree. So to add on that, so far we've been seeing the use of objective study endpoints like overall survival, body height, straightforward. Now, to further this, to accept more sophisticated, complex endpoint, it does need a systematic collaborative effort to really demonstrate the validity of the measure of those endpoints in the selected data sources. So another point is to design a non-interventional study or to use real-world evidence support decision-making when the investigator, the design of the people is help to understand the disease of interest. help to understand the treatment landscape. Also understand the clinical context and the regulatory context of the study, why the study were planned, carry out, whether this is a clinical context, I mean, whether there's a unmet medical need, there's a known mechanism of the drug of interest. Regulatory context, we mean whether this is the first time or this is a supplementary application, whether this is target accelerated approval versus traditional approval. All those factors help design and provide a more interpretable study result.
So I want to add that real world data are very complex. So really there's no one size fits all solution. It needs to be about case by case. So communication is the key. For sponsors, please come to the FDA early and often so we can have this open communication. And because real world data are so complex, I think for our field, we also need to promote communication, to share lessons learned. So I will come back to the vaccine underreporting example I showed earlier about COVID vaccines. Actually, underreporting also happens in influenza vaccines when it was offered at workplace, and also when it's relatively inexpensive and people can pay out of pocket for convenience. But this underreporting may not be the case for other vaccines. For example, zoster vaccines is expensive, not offered at workplace. So the claims data and EHR data can capture vaccination data pretty well. So you can see that there are differences across different data sources. Also within the same data source, there are differences. So it really need to be evaluated case by case. I think promoting communication is the key. Thank you.
One idea that occurs to me is we all learn little bits as we submit, and what we might learn might not seem important at the time, but cumulatively it probably is. And for example, if we submit an application, and since you're sitting there, I'll say it's using IQVIA's Pharmetrics database, and we propose using a specific variable, maybe the FDA has given an opinion on that variable for that use case. It's not personal. That's how they feel about that variable in that database in that use case. If there was a way to share how the FDA reflected on that to others, maybe we don't go back and try to propose the same thing. And or maybe there are some things, the building blocks, you know, we know that the FDA has said this about this endpoint in this database previously. Let's go from there. I don't know that there's a good mechanism for doing that now. When Sebastian, when you publish, you get 2,500 words and you have to explain how you replicated 10 studies across 5 databases. You don't have time to say, this is how this one variable was validated. So maybe it seems not exciting, but I think sharing that in a way that maintains confidentiality, and you're not promising anything. You're not saying, you know, if you do this way, we guarantee we'll accept it, but maybe a registry of precedents would be an idea.
Jenny?
Yeah, so this probably the timing we mentioned the advancing RWE program that FDA have been started. We do ask the sponsor can submit a meeting request with RWE submissions. As a part of agreement, we would expose certain information, why it's successful, why it's not successful. That's kind of promoted the information sharing and lesson learned.
Fantastic discussion on that first question. Stefan, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
Yeah, I agree, but I want to just reiterate and reinforce the importance of the quality of the data sources. And I think you need to more proactively effectively work on describing the data sets, defining the variables, do validation studies so that so it's really clear to everyone how the data was put together, what selection was built into that, building that data base, what variables were used, how were they defined, and how can you report the validity of them. That is key to understand then the outcomes of the various studies that are performed in that data set. That's something at least we are working with in Europe to directly try to define the common data sets, define the variables that all the different registries across the different patients have to, or should at least after a while, adapt to as much as possible so that we understand what data we're working with. That will increase the quality. And I think if that's published, made publicly available, it can attract more researchers to use the data that have been collectively collected and described.
Thank you all. I already have several from online, but I think we're going to go in person first and see if anyone here in the room has questions. I see in the back corner. A mic's coming.
I've been working part of the time for about 20 years in Norway, Stephen, and my experience with trying to access the registries is that it's very complicated unless you know the owners. If you're in the medical field, you can sometimes do it. So it's not just privacy. So maybe that's changed. I have two comments. One is getting access to the registry data is very difficult. The second comment is registries, at least in Norway, are fantastic. They're very clean, the data quality is good. They spend a lot of time and energy to make sure things are in good shape. So I'm applauding the efforts on registries in Scandinavia. But how do you get to them?
So my response to that, if that's a question to me, that has been a problem in many countries, including Sweden and Norway. It's been better because for both regulatory but also for other reasons. So in Sweden, we cannot decline anybody access to data. It's more difficult in Denmark at the moment. In Sweden, we have to give access to data to whoever is asking for it. There are some downsides to that because some companies for profit want to take advantage of it because they are also delivered for free and they set up their own repositories for profit, which is against the overall purpose of the data collections. So we have to make some regulations. It has to be clear that there's a research purpose with it. It has to result in some sort of publication. It has to be publicly clear what the product is aiming for. But if that is fulfilled, all proposals to the steering committee are accepted with a very small fee. So that has improved, and it should improve, yes, because it's very important that access is granted.
Thank you. I saw here next, I think.
Good afternoon. My name is Melva Covington. I'm with a company called Agape Strategic Solutions that looks at not only building data, but using it and applying it to address disparities in outcomes. It's good to see you, Simon. My question really is, and I enjoyed the AI in real world analysis session, as well as this session that focuses on the methodologies, but I'm always looking at not only understanding how you build data, but how you make sure that it is inclusive. I'm very worried. Someone was thrilled about what we can do with AI. I'm actually very worried about what we can do with AI because unless the data sources and unless the information is not only built, but done in a methodological way that's validated, it is not only garbage in, but garbage out, but it's used in such a way that can be actually dangerous to certain patient populations. So I'm struck because I've sat really in the world of COVID in which you can collect data, and even if you collect data or want to collect data, patient populations don't believe the data that's collected, and they don't want to participate in the process. So I think that as we now talking about in this instance, registry data, the question that really prompted my question, I think, was how do you get the registry data? And I would submit that the way that you can get access to data that's built from registries, particularly in the US, is to partner with people and communities and organizations that's building it. That's a lag, right? So we look at organizations and we evaluate whether or not we want to, deal with them or partner with them. And unless they have data that we want, we won't deal with it. Well, the community has issues and they want data that's collected in such a way so they can partner with you. So one of the ways that I just either want to present to the panel for consideration as we think about the methodologies as we build these databases, but also as we think about ways in which we can engage with people who are very willing to not only build these data sources for which AI can be not only tested on, but also use this so that the information is relevant for patient populations. I look at what's going to reduce disparities in outcomes. That's what I'm looking at. Unless what we build is not going to do something that's going to make a difference for those who are excluded from the process, then we're missing something. And we're talking the same thing over and over again for years and years and years. So I will absolutely stop there. Ask you for your response or your feedback and really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Anyone want to comment on that?
So registry is not a kind of standard term. There are many different types of registries, obviously, right? I think one approach to increase the diversity in the source population that you have access to through whatever mechanism is probably kind of to work with EHR or claims data that reach populations that are Medicaid insured, that are uninsured. If through EHR systems, you reach uninsured subjects as well, as long as you engage practices in clinics and hospitals that see patients coming from these underserved populations, right? Right, leave it there.
I think it starts by measuring the variables we're interested in. Claims were never meant to be an all-encompassing data source. You only need enough information so that the insurance company can pay the provider. So that's very, very limited. I think EHR is a step in the right direction. And I have to think that the larger the source of the EHR, the better it will represent the population. So if we can move away from having a single institution selling their EHR data, which is likely only representative of their capture area, and having larger data sources, I think that's how we first get to measurement, and then we can try to assess the solutions to address the disparities. But without measuring, it's very hard to know how to act.
Yeah, so FDA value patient diversity. We want to be inclusive for the study, including all patient populations. We have multiple programs to promote diversity, be inclusive. Also, for FDA's RWE program, we're open to engage with inside, outside stakeholders, and we sometimes have a meeting, have communities, a stakeholder come in to present their perspective. So we were all ready to be engaged. Feel free to reach out to us and to have a conversation with us.
So I agree with Jenny. I want to echo her sentiment. So we want to encourage diverse and inclusive trials and studies, because it's so important that when we evaluate safety and effectiveness, we include the population who are impacted. Because when we did real-world studies, actually, we observed the differences across different subpopulations. So it's so important that we have the data. And also what I'm hearing from the audience asking questions more about the data access, how to access patient level data from, let's say, registries. And also for us from FDA point of view, also we're facing challenges requesting patient level data. So I think this field will need to work together. First, we need to raise awareness about these challenges we're facing, about data accessing. How can we make the data available to interested parties? How to move this forward together? Because we need methodologies to address these challenges, address this concern. But first, we need to make it aware to the public so people can work together. And also about diversity and inclusion, also we need to raise awareness, make people be aware of the impact of those underserved population, people who are underrepresented in randomized clinical trials. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to cut to an online question quickly. Apart from the use of real-world evidence for adding value to randomized clinical trials, do you on the panel think real-world evidence mainly fits into regulatory decision-making in the post-marketing setting for already approved drugs, or is there also a space for it elsewhere? Okay.
There's a quote from an FDA article that comes to mind. I'll maybe butcher it, but it's something like the use of real-world data in development is already well established and encouraged. So we use it extensively throughout all stages of development. We try to understand the burden of illness, the epidemiology, the standard of care. We try to refine our study populations. We try to understand the standard of care. We try to, if we can, simulate the trial. We use it to enroll sites, to enroll patients. It's not just post-marketing. Whether the FDA needs to weigh in on those parts is the real question. It's a lot of that I would consider real-world insights. They're internal analyses that we use to make decisions, but they're not necessarily things that we have to submit to a regulator. Therefore, we have more liberty to analyze that data.
I think the FDA is quite public. There was a paper on pharmacopeic drug safety authored by Peter Stein, John Concaro, Mark Levinson, and other leaders in the agency, where they lay out the use cases for the FDA, some being pre-market, largely the ECAs, and many of them are post-market. It's really an article worth reading, pharmacopeic drug safety.
Yeah, I would say most of the cases I've seen are post-market, meaning that the drug proved, but they may come back for new indication or new dosing. That being said, they are occasionally, we saw first-time approval based on real-world evidence, especially in rare disease areas. I would say because of the high unmet medical need. And there was earlier conversation on real-world evidence support common diseases or chronic diseases. Perhaps we have a saying that the 1,000 miles journey starts first step. I would say rare diseases really we saw patient really need sort of additional or being flexible or consider all options when the unmet medical need is so high. So that's somewhere I saw quite many cases.
Yeah.
So I want to add that based on what we're seeing at the CBER, there are RWE submissions, not only about post-marketing safety and effective studies, but also supporting the pre-licensure. Again, I'm going to use COVID vaccine as an example, because COVID vaccine was first authorized as EUA and then later have full approval. We also have data from other countries. And we also have vaccines that extended to different age groups, and we have booster dose, we have different types of vaccine for each season. So basically, we have seen this in the pre-licensure submission. And also I want to emphasize on the iterative nature of the learning experience to inform future studies, because before the pandemic, we have been working on the influenza vaccine effective study every year. And we are familiar with the underreporting of vaccination status. So it helps us during the review for COVID vaccines that we can quickly capture that potential source of biases. So you can see that the real world data and real world evidence, the lessons learned actually can inform future studies, future submissions, not only the same products, it can inform other products and also can help us understand the data better. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And Stefan, I want to pull you in on this next one also from our online audience. We heard a lot in the earlier session and in this one about interesting things being done with registries primarily based in European countries where the quality of the registries is regularly checked. We also heard from the audience about how good some of them are. How do we think about translating some of the lessons from those experiences to here in the US? And what's kind of our situation comparably with the real data sets we have available? So anyone want to weigh in? But Stefan, I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to translate lessons from your work to what we're trying to do here in the States.
Yeah, it's a good and difficult question. Of course, the situation in the US is more complex. It's more heterogeneous. There are more stakeholders. There's more funding included in everything. We are currently doing a trial called the SPIRIT, spironolactone and heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. We're using registries in Sweden to identify patients, enroll patients, and follow up patients. And we partnered with the US with NIH grant. And we hope to be able to enroll multiple patients in the US. Unfortunately, 90% of the patients have been enrolled in Sweden and 10% in the US. And we had a very hard time finding a registry to collaborate with. So we had to eventually build the trial, not exactly around the registry, but using call centers and other pragmatic elements in this randomized trial. And so it is difficult in the US, although there are registries. I mean, the professional organizations, ACCHA, do have registries. They are, as far as I understand, they're charging quite a bit to use the data, which is unfortunate. But I think you have to try to build based on what you have. And you have to try to build more incentives into the collection of data into various registries. I feel that there's a lack of incentive of really carefully entering data unselectively into registries in the US many times. Sometimes it's linked to reimbursement, but then it has, it becomes an issue of whether or not you get funding or not. So it's not really science-based. So I don't have a clear answer how to really improve the situation. I think there are always possibilities if you try to work on incentives more, trying to change the culture. That's the way, at least the way I've worked, always try to make sure that everybody who's involved in entering data into registries and using registries to build in incentives everywhere. So making sure that the data are accessible, that they really improve care, that they are used to improve care for patients, that the physicians can always get access to data that they're interested in. And by doing that, I think you can eventually make registries more available and more complete. Until then, you have to work with what you have and try to make the best of them. And that is, I think, to describe what you have in the registries, validate the outcomes, report registries very well, publish everything about the quality and the validation of them.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And I didn't get him in before he left, but Simon had to run before we were quite done. So thank him for his great contributions to the panel today. The rest of us have just a few minutes left. So does anyone else want to weigh in on that last question, Jenny? And then we'll go back to the room.
So there are huge advantage for mandatory registry, means everyone enrolled by requirement. Here in the US, registry tend to be smaller voluntary participation. But we do see sometimes patient registry provide valuable information, especially for rare disease drug development. Sometimes registry has a longer duration of study follow-up, which could support a study of chronic diseases or long-term treatment effect or developmental outcome in pediatric populations. We see a case, for example, there are short-term randomized trials serve as adequate well-controlled studies, where registry serve as external control compared to extended trial data to provide a long-term treatment effect evidence. So that's what
I want to add that for registry, actually, in the US, people have been using registry linking to EHR data and claims data to resolve the issue due to under-reporting of vaccination status. So immunization registry have been frequently used. And for European country data and US data, I think the data quality is different. They have their own challenges. And I think it's really important that we also learn from each other, and also we understand the different source of biases in all the different types of data sources. Yeah, thank you.
I thought Stefan's comment was quite wise by saying build on what you have, because obviously Scandinavia is so different for all the obvious reasons. I think the development that I see in the US and internationally is AI-supported scribes. It turns out that dermatologists, because they do economically quite well, they hire scribes, people sitting in the meeting and they're recording things, right? And of course, now multiple startup companies, they have an AI doing exactly that, right? Listening into the patient-physician interaction, and from that deriving diagnostic information, which leads directly to billing, which is the economic incentive. But of course, we as researchers, we're interested in the added information that is collected, right? And I think that will spread like a wildfire in the US, inpatient setting as well as outpatient settings. In mental health particularly, where we have better and better tools where patients speak for 1 minute on a certain topic, and just by the way they speak and what they talk about, an AI can differentiate all the major mental health diagnoses right away, right? So there is enormous gain in information, which is paralyzed with improvement in how we provide care, right? We cannot burden the medical system in recording more and more. We need to find incentives that are aligned with better care and better information collection. And I think AI will be a crucial helper here.
Thanks so much. We got a few minutes left. Anyone in the room have questions? I can't see through the podium, so I'm sorry to anyone in the corner over here. No? Okay. Any final thoughts from the panel that you want to make sure to leave our audience with?
I want to say that we need to see the opportunities more than the barriers and limitations. Use what we have, make sure that we report what all the data sources have and publish it more, make it more available, more accessible, and more openly descriptive. Use new technologies to improve it. And by using the data sources more, the better they will be. They will be improved by the usage, by the utility. So making it accessible, open, and publish everything, it will really improve the quality over time. And so I see huge opportunities also for countries like the US, who is lagging a bit as compared to my environment. Yeah.
I guess my closing comment would be this, picking up the comment that was made beforehand and learning from the individual decision making. It's like a journal club, it's like a post-mortem, right? We talk about what led us to a certain decision to approve a drug or make certain recommendations. Sharing that information leads to shared learning, leads to more standardization of decision making. There's only benefits for that. I appreciate there's confidentiality concerns and things like that, and it needs to be worked out when we talk about real products and real sponsors behind them. But I think that's worthwhile looking into and investing in this and being transparent in the learning, in the shared learning, because we're all in this together, really.
So you heard us talking about challenges. Actually, that is also opportunities for us to develop new methodologies. So we mentioned about biases in the data sources. For example, under-reporting vaccination status, how do we develop methods to address that issue? And we're talking about American funding, about patient level data access issue. So for people in the audience, please think about how you can develop methodology, help us address those real concerns so we can work together to move this forward. Thank you.
I would want to wrap up by highlight again that the importance of collaboration, communication among clinicians, trialists, epidemiologists, statisticians, and other stakeholder, patient representative. Only when we have a dialogue together, we could really understand the context, design a good study, deliver quality evidence.
And there was one more question behind the podium I couldn't see. So we'll hand it over here and then we'll quickly, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, I'm Neil Belson. I'm a life science attorney here in Maryland. And my question is for Sebastian, although feel free, anyone else, to jump in. And specifically, one of the remarks you made at the beginning of your presentation, where you suggested doing like a real world sort of RWE duplicate of the phase 3 clinical trial with your early, if I understand, I apologize if not rephrasing it correctly, an RWD study comparing your early results with what you got in phase 3. And I'm wondering if you should realistically expect that the results from the RWD of in the early commercial use to exactly parallel the use in the phase 3 study, given that the patient population in the RWD will, first of all, probably not have the same inclusion-exclusion criteria, will be from a much broader slice of the population than was in the clinical trial, will not have the careful monitoring to make sure that the adherence is the same. Basically, you'll introduce a lot of variables. And if the results are not exactly the same as in the phase 3 trial, would that necessarily indicate a flaw, or would it just indicate that the impact is perhaps different under real world conditions as opposed to in the clinical trial?
So good question. Most of the time in our RC duplicate project, it was design aspects that could not be emulated because they're not reflecting clinical practice. It was measurement issues that could not be solved with the data that we had in hand. And therefore, we would expect slightly different findings and things like that. Since you're an attorney, I want to bring out what's the other thing that's going through my mind when you think about expanding the indication. You, by definition, use off-label use information, right, and include that into real-world evidence. There's a lot of confusion out there in the community, and maybe FDA can clarify, and I thought I read it somewhere in the guidance documents that they are quite open to utilizing off-label use, but at the same time, companies are quite concerned about this being construed as off-label marketing or promoting off-label use or things like that. I think that space needs to have some more clarification, because it's important, of course, that we make use of the data that is generated by off-label use if we want to use it for expanding indications.
Thank you.
And thank you to this wonderful panel helping us close out the day. With that, we're going to wrap this session. I am pleased to cede the stage back to Dr. Corrigan Karai to help close us out for the day. Thank you all.
So thank you, everyone. It's been a really great afternoon. We packed a lot into I guess 4.5 hours. When I think back to the discussions that we had, probably I think a Duke meeting after we did the framework and one of the first RWE meetings, we've come really far, but then what we heard today is there's a lot of issues still to address. And that's, the comment that we should look for opportunities, I think, is what we really want CCRI to do. So take some of this feedback we heard today. We heard everything from, AI both sort of expanding the capture of real world data through the AI scribes that I've heard about, and then perhaps illuminating a lot about real world data and its quality from what we heard from in the first panel. In this issue of registries versus do we always need registries? Can we use the EHR? There's a lot of things that we need to think about. Do we need to think about our international partnerships and focus a little more that we've done all these guidances? Is everyone else aligned, and can we seek greater alignment? So, I'm very excited with what we heard. Again, I'd like to reemphasize there is a docket open. I know there's a lot of you online. Please remember, send your thoughts, what you think should be our priorities. We're here to listen, and we look forward to continued engagement and as we bring CCRI forward. Thank you again to John, because we wouldn't be at this stage if it wasn't for him. We look forward to continuing to your expertise as much as we can. Thank you.
One last note, less about the content, more about the tailored thanks. For the folks in the audience here, a couple thousand folks online, please take Dr. Corrigan-Karai's statement as sincere. Your inputs today are great, but it's December 13th and onward that we're really excited for your continued engagement. Also, sincere thanks to our speakers and panelists across the board. We appreciate the time, not only to put together such thoughtful remarks and contributions here, but your decades of work that leads up to being able to have such thoughtful remarks. Next up, also the tech and AV team in the back. Couldn't do any of this without you, so sincere thanks to the conference team. And then, obviously we've got some colleagues here that you met on stage, Rachel Hendricks-Sturrup, Trevin Locke, but we've really got these teams in the background on both the FDA and the Duke-Margolis side that work for months to really put these things together. So first things first, on the FDA side, Deanne Perrowan, Kristen Miller, John, so grateful. There's a cast of folks in the background also behind you, I know, but seeing in the room, sincere thanks there. And then on our side, Valerie Parker, Miriam Naffey, kind of running the ship for us for months to make sure that these things happen and occur as they do. And then also in the background, Luke Durasher, Hannah Vitello. Thank you. With that, everybody have a good evening. Happy holidays. See you soon.